He had solved problems that stumped entire engineering teams. He had a mind that could untangle systems most people couldn't even read. And on a Tuesday morning, he stood in the lobby of one of the most powerful tech companies in the country, wearing scuffed boots and a jacket that had seen better winters, applying for a job pushing a mop. Nobody looked twice at Ethan Holloway. Nobody except the woman watching him from the security feed in her corner office. CEO Victoria Ashcroft, 30 years old, running a billion-dollar empire from a wheelchair, her hands going still the moment she saw his name on the application. She remembered that name. She would never forget it. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The elevator in the Nexus Technologies building was the kind that made you feel important just by stepping into it. Glass walls, polished steel, a soft chime that sounded like it had been designed by someone who thought even elevator tones should feel premium. It rose 42 floors without a single shake or hesitation. Ethan Holloway rode it to the lobby level, not up. He had taken the stairs to get his bearings, spent 3 minutes in the men's room making sure his collar sat straight, and now he stood at the base of the building watching the morning crowd stream through the revolving doors. People in tailored coats and sharp shoes, carrying bags that probably cost more than his monthly rent, moving with the particular confidence of people who had somewhere to be and knew it. He watched them the way he watched most things, quietly, without making it obvious. The lobby was enormous, marble floors with a subtle geometric inlay, the Nexus logo, an interlocking N and X in deep blue, suspended above the reception desk in backlit acrylic. The place smelled like money and climate control. Plants arranged with the kind of precision that suggested a landscaping contract, not a human touch. Ethan walked to the reception desk and told the woman behind it that he had an appointment with HR. He had his paperwork in a manila envelope he'd borrowed from his neighbor, Mrs. Tran, who had given it to him along with a container of congee for Sophie, because that was the kind of person she was. The receptionist looked at him the way receptionists in places like this always looked at people who didn't quite fit the aesthetic. Not rude, just evaluating. She typed something, checked a screen, and pointed him toward a bank of chairs near the east wall. "Someone will be right with you," she said. He sat down, put the envelope on his knee, looked at his boots, which he'd polished last night after Sophie fell asleep, and decided they still looked like what they were, old boots that had been taken care of. He'd arrived in the city 11 days ago, coming in from Millhaven, a town 200 miles west that most people in this building had never heard of. He and Sophie had packed what fit in 2 suitcases and a duffel, and his friend Marcus had driven them in a pickup truck that stalled twice on the highway. Sophie had slept most of the way with her head against the window and her stuffed bear, a threadbare thing she called Captain, tucked under her arm. She was 7. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and a laugh that could make Ethan feel, even on the worst days, like things were going to be okay. They were staying in a 2-room apartment in the Glenner district, 4th floor, no elevator, a radiator that knocked all night. The walls were thin enough that he could hear the couple in the next unit arguing about whose turn it was to do dishes. The view was a brick wall and a slice of sky. Sophie had declared it cozy and taped a drawing of a butterfly above her bed, and Ethan had smiled and agreed. The apartment was $320 a month more than what he'd budgeted. He'd applied to 12 jobs. He'd gotten 3 responses. This was one of them. "Done. Mr. Holloway?" The woman who came to collect him from the lobby was young, maybe 25, with a lanyard that said HR Associate, Cassandra Bloom, and the particular brisk cheerfulness of someone trying to make a Monday morning feel like an opportunity. "That's me," Ethan said, standing. She led him through a badge-check corridor and up to the 3rd floor, which turned out to be the HR wing, a series of glass-walled offices and open workstations arranged around a central break area. Someone had put a fake succulent on every desk. He counted 7 fake succulents before they stopped at an office with a door that said Department Hiring, Facilities and Support Services. Inside was a man in his 40s named Gerald, who had reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the look of someone who processed a lot of paperwork and had made peace with it. "Ethan Holloway," Gerald said, looking at a screen. "Applying for the building maintenance associate position. Janitorial services morning shift." "That's correct." Gerald studied his screen for a moment, then he looked up. Then he looked back at the screen like he was checking something. "I see from your application you have a bachelor's degree," Gerald said. "Mathematics, Alderton University, And it looks like you started a doctoral program there as well. Left before completing. I did. Can I ask why you were applying for this position specifically? Ethan had been asked this question before, in different forms, by different people, with varying degrees of tact. The hours work with my schedule, he said. I have a daughter. Morning shift means I can be home in the afternoon. Gerald nodded slowly. He was a decent man, Ethan could tell. The kind who genuinely tried to match people to roles rather than just fill boxes. Your references check out, Gerald said. And your previous maintenance experience? You worked for Millhaven School District? 4 years. Facilities and grounds. I also helped them update their inventory system, but that was informal. You helped update their inventory system. It was a spreadsheet issue, mostly. They had a process that was creating a lot of redundant work. I just restructured it. Gerald looked at him for a moment. We actually have other openings, Mr. Holloway. I want to be upfront with you. Data analysis team, quality assurance. If your background, I appreciate it, Ethan said. The maintenance position is what I'm looking for. Gerald wrote something on a notepad. He seemed like a man who'd learned not to push when a door was clearly closed. All right, he said. Let me show you the benefits package. Font. What Ethan didn't know was that his application had flagged in a system review 2 days earlier. Nexus Technologies used a resume screening platform that cross-referenced applicants against a proprietary database, education records, publications, professional registries. It was more thorough than most companies' systems, which was part of what made Nexus so difficult to get into. When Ethan's file hit the analytics desk, it had generated a secondary alert. Alderton Doctoral Program, Mathematics. Thesis research on computational logistics optimization. 2 published conference papers written at 23 that had been cited 41 times in the intervening years by people who had gone on to build systems that were now industry standard. The alert had ended up on the desk of Victoria Ashcroft's executive assistant, who had brought it to Victoria because that was the protocol when an application contained a red flag. The system couldn't tell the difference between a red flag and something else entirely. Victoria had read the file herself, late on a Friday evening. She had sat very still for a long time. Then she had asked her assistant to make sure Gerald's interview with Ethan Holloway was flagged for her awareness. Victoria Ashcroft ran Nexus Technologies from the 42nd floor in a corner office that she had redesigned when she took over as CEO 18 months ago. The previous CEO had favored dark wood and leather, a lot of vertical space and imposing furniture. Victoria had cleared it out and brought in lower surfaces, wider aisles, a conference table with space on 3 sides for her wheelchair to move freely. The window faced east, and she liked to begin her mornings watching the city come to light. She had been in the wheelchair for 4 years. The accident had happened on a February night. Black ice, a truck that had drifted lanes, a collision that had taken 6 seconds and 42 years of walking. She had spent 8 months in rehab, and 6 months after that running Nexus from a hospital satellite office, while she and her team restructured the upper management following a board crisis that had nearly dissolved the company. She was 30 years old, and she had been tired in a bone-deep way for most of them, and she was also the most effective leader Nexus had ever had, and both of those things were simply true at the same time. Her assistant, a calm and organized man named James, knocked and entered at 9:47. HR is confirming the interview went well for the building maintenance position. Gerald says the candidate was cooperative and straightforward, no red flags. Did Gerald offer him the analyst opening? He did. Candidate declined. Victoria looked at the city below her window. He declined. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. She pressed her fingers together, a habit when she was processing something. What time does Gerald have him for orientation? This Friday, 8 a.m., if he accepts the offer. Have Gerald send me the final paperwork before he extends. James made a note. Anything else? No, she said. Then, actually, pull whatever we have on the Alderton Math Department, 2009 through 2014. Publication records, faculty reviews, anything accessible. Any particular reason? She considered how to answer that. Background research, she said finally. James nodded and left without asking more. He had worked for her long enough to understand which questions she wanted answered and which ones she just needed to think aloud. The thing about Ethan Holloway that nobody at Nexus understood yet was that he had spent years becoming invisible on purpose. It had not always been that way. At Alderton, he had been the kind of student that professors bring up years later in classes, the casual legend, the kid who spent one evening solving a problem that a visiting professor had spent 6 months on, not to show off, but because he'd wandered into the faculty lounge during an open session, and the problem had been on the board, and his brain didn't know how to ignore things like that. His name had circulated in the mathematics department the way certain names do, quietly, passed between advisors like a recommendation. He had also been, in his junior year, the person who had spent 4 weeks tutoring Victoria Ashcroft through a required statistics course that she was close to failing. Not because she wasn't smart, but because she was carrying a full scholarship and working 20 hours a week, and the numbers were starting to blur together from exhaustion. They had studied in the library on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and sometimes an extra session on Sunday afternoons when she had a quiz coming up. He had been patient in a way that wasn't performance. He genuinely didn't understand why people found teaching tedious. If he could see the gap between where someone was and where they needed to be, he wanted to close it. That was just how his mind worked. She had passed the course. Barely, but she had passed. They had talked a few times after that. Cafeteria, a campus event, once at a study group party where they'd both spent most of the evening having a conversation in the corner about information theory that neither of them had expected to have at a party. He had been one of the most interesting people she'd met. And then he had graduated and she had moved on to a master's program, and then her first job, and then the grinding work of building something. And he had simply disappeared. She had wondered sometimes, over the years, mostly when something happened that reminded her of him. A particular kind of problem, a certain quiet confidence in someone she met. What had happened to him? She had not expected this. Ethan's first day was a Thursday. He arrived at 6:12 in the morning before the building was fully occupied, when the lobby was dim and the cleaning crews were finishing the overnight work. He found the facilities manager, a tired-looking man named Roy, who had the disposition of someone who'd been on his feet for 30 years and was proud of it. And Roy walked him through the supply room, the equipment, the routes. The morning shift at Nexus covered floors 1 through 18, common areas and bathrooms, and the glass-walled conference rooms that lined the east side of the building. He was given a cart, a cleaning schedule on a laminated card, and a blue uniform with his name stitched over the left chest pocket. Roy showed him the supply protocol, the equipment log, the request system for specialized cleaning jobs. "You got questions? Ask me. Don't bother the executives," Roy said. Not unkindly, just practically. "Understood," Ethan said. Roy sized him up the way experienced people size up someone new. Not hostile, not friendly, just looking to see what he had. "You seem calm," Roy said. "I'm good with early mornings." Roy nodded once, apparently satisfied with that, and went back to his own work. Ethan started on floor 3. He cleaned the conference rooms first, because that was where the morning meetings would start, and he'd learned from experience that conference rooms generated more disorder than people expected. Coffee rings, whiteboard marker that hadn't been capped, paper plates from catered lunches left under chairs. He worked methodically, moving around the space the way he did most things, with an economy of motion that came from years of not having extra time to waste. In the first week, he started noticing things, not because he was looking for them. His brain just gathered data the way a drain gathered water. It didn't have a choice. The recycling bins were placed inconsistently with foot traffic, which meant people defaulted to the nearest bin regardless of type, which meant the recycling was contaminated and the facilities team spent extra time sorting. He mentioned this to Roy, who said he'd bring it up in the facilities review. The floor wax schedule on 6 produced a residue buildup near the elevator banks because the machines weren't getting full drying time before the next application. He mentioned that too. Roy listened to both suggestions with the same neutral expression and said, "I'll look into it." The bin placement changed on day 9. The wax schedule changed on day 11. Roy didn't mention Ethan's input to anyone, but he didn't need to. He got home by 3:30 most days, which meant he was there when Sophie got out of the school van at 3:45. He had enrolled her at Chandler Elementary, 4 blocks from the apartment, public school with decent reviews, and a library that was open after hours for parents. She was adjusting. She had her mother's particular brand of social courage, the ability to walk into a room and find, by some instinct Ethan did not share, the one person who was also looking for a friend. She'd come home on day 3 with the information that her teacher was named Ms. Holt, and that Ms. Holt had a plant on her desk named Fernando, and that Sophie had been allowed to water Fernando. Was Fernando okay with that? Ethan asked. Dad, he's a plant. Plants have feelings. That's not science. How do you know? She had considered this with the same focused expression she used when she was deciding whether to argue a point, and then she said, I'll check the library, and that was the end of it. He made dinner. They did her homework at the kitchen table, her on her workbook, him sometimes solving things in his notebook alongside her. Not math problems, just things that had been running through his mind during the day, systems that could be cleaner, patterns he'd noticed. It was how he'd always processed things. His notebook was a mess, half equation, half observation, the kind of document that would be useless to anyone who hadn't been living inside his head. After Sophie went to bed, he'd sit at the kitchen table and go over her school calendar for the week. Note what she needed, pack her bag. Make sure the lunch was simple and complete. He did not think about what he had given up to be here. He was good at not thinking about that. It was in the third week that Ethan first met Derek Vaughn. Derek was Nexus's operations manager, which was a title that carried genuine authority at Nexus. He oversaw building logistics, contract management, vendor relations, and had a team of 32 people. He was 44, broad-shouldered, with the particular confidence of a man who had spent most of his career being the most senior person in whatever room he was in and had come to confuse that seniority with intelligence. Ethan first heard about him from Lucy, one of the day shift cleaners, who mentioned his name in the same way that people mention a structural problem, matter-of-factly, without drama, because you should just know. Derek walks the building on Tuesdays, she said. He likes things a certain way. Don't be in his way. What does he mean by a certain way? Ethan asked. He means his way, Lucy said, and he doesn't always explain which way that is until you've already done it wrong. The first interaction happened on a Tuesday, as predicted. Ethan was in the hallway on 12, mopping around a water fountain that had been leaking slightly onto the tile. He'd already submitted a maintenance request for the fountain itself, which was a separate process. He was nearly finished when Derek came around the corner with two junior managers who were working hard to keep up with his stride. Derek looked at the wet floor, at Ethan, and stopped. How long has this been like this? He said. Not to Ethan specifically, to the hallway in general. I put in a maintenance request this morning for the fountain, Ethan said. The floor will be dry in about 10 minutes. Derek looked at him. It was the look of a man recalibrating. He'd expected either silence or apology and gotten neither. The fountain, Derek repeated. Slow leak in the drain fitting. It's been accumulating for a few days, probably. I've noted it before, but this is the first time it's been significant enough to reach the floor. One of the junior managers wrote something on a tablet. Derek looked at Ethan for another moment. Who are you? Ethan. Building maintenance. Morning shift. You're new. 3 weeks. Derek looked at the wet floor. Looked at Ethan. Looked at the cart. This hallway is on the executive route, Derek said. When executives are walking through in the morning, I need these floors dry. I understand. Don't let it happen again, Derek said, and walked on before Ethan could finish the sentence. The two junior managers followed him. One of them glanced back. Not unkindly, just acknowledging. Ethan finished mopping the floor. He checked the maintenance request. He moved to the next section. He'd met versions of Derek before. The species was not uncommon. He had learned after Claire died that the only way to keep moving was to stop comparing what was to what had been. That kind of comparison was a door that, once opened, was almost impossible to close. Claire had been 31. She had died on a Tuesday in October, from a diagnosis that had arrived in January and moved faster than anyone expected. He had been her caregiver for 9 months, and Sophie had been 6. And there had been a period in those months where the apartment in Millhaven felt like a ship that was taking on water faster than he could bail it out, and he just had to keep bailing. He didn't talk about it, not because it wasn't there, but because talking about it in the specific way that people expected, the grief counselor sessions, the support group check-ins, the particular ritual of explaining what it had been like, required something he didn't have to spare. He had put it somewhere. He wasn't sure it was behind him. But it was not in the room where Sophie needed him to be present, and that was what mattered. He thought about her sometimes, in the mornings, when it was early and quiet and he was moving through an empty building and there was nothing to distract him. He'd think about the specific color of her laugh, The way she'd insisted on buying the most impractical houseplants and then genuinely nursed them back when they were dying. The argument they'd had, 6 months before the diagnosis, about whether a road trip they never ended up taking would go north or south. He thought about those things. Then he went back to work. Bullshit. By the end of the month, Roy had started giving Ethan the floor assignments that were harder to manage. High traffic areas, the kitchen on 14 that was always a disaster after catering events, the server corridor on 9 that required a specific cleaning protocol and some basic understanding of what was in the room. He trusted Ethan to read a space and respond to it. Ethan didn't mention this to anyone. He also didn't mention that he'd started noticing patterns in the cleaning schedule across the whole floor plan, overlaps and gaps, inefficiencies that were costing the facilities team an extra 90 minutes a week minimum. He drew it out in his notebook one evening, mostly because his brain wouldn't stop circling it. He wasn't planning to show anyone. It was just how he thought. He ran into Victoria Ashcroft for the first time on a morning in his 5th week. He had not planned for this either. He was on the 41st floor. There was a maintenance access from there to the mechanical room on 42, and Roy had sent him to check on a reported issue with a utility sink. When the elevator doors opened across the hall and she came out. She was in a charcoal blazer, hair pulled back, a tablet in her lap. Her chair was compact and maneuvered cleanly. She was reading something on the tablet as she came out, and she glanced up when she heard the cart. They looked at each other. He saw the recognition happen in her face. Not immediate, a few seconds, like a photograph developing. Her expression didn't change in any dramatic way. It just shifted. The way a room shifts when someone opens a window. "Ethan Holloway," she said. It wasn't a question. "Ms. Ashcroft," he said. She looked at him steadily. She had always looked at things steadily. He remembered that about her from Alderton. She didn't look away from things that were complicated.
"You know," she said after a moment, "I thought about calling you when I saw the application, but James told me that would be unusual." "It would have been," he agreed. "You turned down the analyst position." "I did." She studied him. He didn't explain. He'd found that not explaining often told people more than explaining did. The shape of the silence was its own kind of information. "How long have you been here?" she asked. 5 weeks. "Are you doing all right? Do you have—" She paused, recalibrating. "You're good?" "I'm good," he said. She looked at him for another moment. She seemed to want to say something else and was deciding against it, and he respected that, the choice to hold something back when you weren't sure where to put it. "It's good to see you," she said finally. "You too," he said. And he meant it. She went back to her tablet and moved toward the stairwell access. He went back to the utility sink.
2 days after that, Derek Vaughn found a reason to visit Roy's office. Ethan didn't hear the conversation directly, but Lucy did, because Lucy's locker was near Roy's office, and Lucy had the particular talent of not drawing attention to herself when she was listening. What she told Ethan later in the supply room was that Derek had been asking about the new maintenance hire on the early shift. That Derek had mentioned, casually, the way a person mentions something while pretending it's not a weapon. That he'd noticed the new guy seemed to spend a lot of time on the upper floors. "He's got the 41st floor in his rotation," Roy had said, apparently. "Is that right?" Derek had said. And that was all. But Lucy had been around long enough to know what that sounded like when you heard it. "He's building something," she said to Ethan. "Maybe," Ethan said. "You should be careful." "I'm careful." She gave him a look that suggested she wasn't entirely convinced, but she let it go. It was late November when the system went down. Ethan heard about it the way most of the building did. The particular shift in atmosphere that happens in a large company when something has gone significantly wrong. People moving faster, conversations cut short, the executive floor buzzing with an energy that was completely distinct from its usual productivity. He was on 8 when it started. A Thursday morning, not quite 7, still early enough that only the infrastructure team and half the executive floor were usually in. By 8:30, engineers had been called in. By 9, there were people in the main conference room on 35 who had been there since 7 and hadn't eaten. He found out the specifics from James, who passed him in the hall outside the break room and said, with the barely contained urgency of a person who is holding it together by professionalism alone, "The core logistics system, Something in the routing algorithm is producing cascading errors. Everything downstream is affected. James didn't elaborate. Ethan didn't ask. He finished his floor assignments. He restocked the supply cart. He started on the conference hallway on 35 because that was his schedule. The main conference room had its blinds open. He could see them through the glass as he moved down the hall. 15 engineers and analysts in various states of focus and stress, standing around a screen that displayed a tangle of equations and system maps. A whiteboard had been pulled in and covered in marker. Different colors, different handwriting, the visual record of 6 hours of attempts. He wasn't planning to look. He looked. His cart was by the door. He had a window wipe in his hand. He was moving to the next panel of glass when his eyes crossed the whiteboard, and his brain did what it always did. It stopped. He stood there for probably 8 seconds, long enough for someone inside to glance up and notice him and look away. He wasn't looking at the room. He was looking at the board. The error was in the recursion. There was a feedback loop in the fourth layer routing function that only activated under a specific combination of load conditions, and nobody had found it because they were looking at the output data rather than the underlying structure. And the output data under those conditions was close enough to plausible that it looked like a data corruption problem rather than a logic error. It wasn't. The structure was wrong. He could see it the way some people see shapes in clouds. Not trying, just unable to not. He stood there another 3 seconds. Then he knocked on the conference room door. One of the engineers opened it. Young, late 20s, tired, holding a paper cup. "Sorry to bother you," Ethan said. "Is there a marker I could borrow?" The engineer looked at him, looked at his uniform. "We're in the middle of heat." "I know. I'll be quick." Something in his voice, the steadiness of it, the lack of apology, made the engineer step back. Ethan walked to the whiteboard. He found a section that wasn't covered and started writing. Not explaining, just writing. The correction to the fourth layer routing function. 3 steps. Clean notation. It took about 90 seconds. He stepped back. "The error's in the recursion," he said. "Layer 4 is creating a feedback condition when load hits 63% threshold and the buffer sync timing is off by more than 40 milliseconds. If you rewrite the third and fourth steps of that function," he pointed to what he'd written, "it collapses the loop." The room had gone quiet. One of the senior engineers was already looking at the board. She was a woman in her 40s, glasses, the particular focus of someone who was running the math in her head in real time. She didn't say anything. She picked up a tablet and started working. Ethan handed the marker back to the engineer by the door. "Sorry for the interruption," he said, and went back to his cart. He had finished the hallway and was starting on the water fountain alcove by the time anyone came out of the conference room. He heard the door open. He didn't look up. "Hey." It was the engineer he'd borrowed the marker from. He looked like someone who'd just been told something his brain was still catching up to. "What you wrote? On the board. It was—" He stopped. "Do you have a background in—" "I just recognized the pattern," Ethan said. "Is the system coming back up?" A pause. "They're testing it now." "Good," Ethan said. He pushed the cart to the next section. The system recovered by 2:17 in the afternoon. The engineering team verified the fix at 2:49. At 3:10, Victoria received a message from her chief technology officer that read, in its entirety, "It worked. The fix from the whiteboard worked. You need to find out who wrote it." She already knew. She sat at her desk for a few minutes after reading that message. The city was doing its late afternoon thing outside the window, that particular slant of November light that made everything look slightly more significant than it was. Then she pulled up Ethan Holloway's employee file and read it again, from the beginning. She had read it before. But this time, she read it differently, looking not at what was in it, but at what was missing. The gap between the doctoral program and this application. 11 years. She knew what Alderton's math program produced. She knew what it took to get the kind of work onto conference papers that were still being cited a decade later. She thought about what 11 years could hold. She thought about what it would cost someone to decide that the work was less important than something else. Not because they'd given up, because they'd chosen. She sat with that for a while. Then she called James and told him she needed the morning block tomorrow. She needed to think. Derek Vaughn called for Ethan through Roy the following morning. Roy relayed it with the particular neutrality of a man who delivered messages without commentary because he understood that commentary was above his pay grade in certain situations. Derek wants to talk to you. His office, 11. Ethan finished what he was doing. He walked to Derek's office at 11. Derek's office was on 19. Not the executive floor, but close enough to make the point. He was behind his desk when Ethan came in, and he didn't gesture for Ethan to sit, which told Ethan something. 2 other men were in the office. One Ethan recognized as a mid-level HR manager named Philip. The other he didn't know. "Close the door," Derek said. Ethan closed it. "You entered a confidential conference session yesterday," Derek said. He said it the way lawyers say things in television dramas. Not a question, a premise. "I knocked and the door was opened," Ethan said. "You're a building maintenance employee." "I am." "That room is flagged for executive and engineering access only. Building maintenance doesn't have clearance for active project sessions." Ethan didn't say anything. "What you did violated company protocol," Derek continued. "We take security in those rooms seriously. What you saw, a whiteboard with equations," Ethan said. "I didn't see anything confidential." "The content of those sessions, is it worth asking why the system recovered after I wrote on the board?" The room went quiet. Derek's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes recalibrated. "That's not the issue," he said. "What's the issue?" "The issue is that an uncleared employee entered a secure session without authorization. The door was opened. I asked to borrow a marker." "You don't borrow markers in the middle of executive engineering sessions," Derek said. His voice had gotten harder. "You don't offer input. You don't write on whiteboards. You don't put yourself in spaces where you don't belong." Ethan looked at him. He had met this particular variety of person before, too. Not just powerful, invested in the hierarchy as a concept, the kind of person who needed the levels to be distinct because the levels were the only thing that made the whole structure feel secure to them. "I hear you," Ethan said. "Good." But Derek straightened some papers on his desk. "This is a formal conversation. It's going in your file. If there's another incident, there won't be," Ethan said. He didn't mean it the way Derek thought he meant it. He was already deciding. He didn't resign that night. He thought about it, walking home in the cold, his breath making small clouds in the November air. He thought about it through dinner, half listening while Sophie told him about an argument she and a classmate had resolved over who got to be the narrator in their class reading project. She wanted to be narrator in character, Sophie explained, with the particular indignation of someone who had suffered a genuine injustice. "You can't be both." "Why not?" Ethan said. Sophie frowned. "Because then she controls everything." "Is that bad?" "It's not fair." He looked at his daughter, her serious expression, the way she still had a smear of something orange on her left sleeve from whatever they'd had for lunch. She was growing up with a very clear sense of what fair meant. He thought that was probably good. He thought that was probably his job. After she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with his notebook. He wrote out the resignation letter in about 4 minutes because he'd known what it was going to say for most of the evening. Clear, professional, no explanations. "Thank you for the opportunity. Effective immediately." He didn't feel sorry for it. He felt the old familiar thing. The knowledge that there were people who would see this as failure, and the equal knowledge that he didn't particularly care what they thought. He had made choices that looked like losses from the outside before. He had learned that the view from the outside was usually incomplete. He sealed the letter in an envelope, set it on the table next to his keys. He looked at Sophie's butterfly drawing, taped above her door down the hall. He went to bed. Victoria found out about Derek's formal conversation at 8:45 the following morning when James flagged the personnel note from HR. She read it twice. She called James. "Get me Derek Vaughn's calendar for this afternoon," she said, "and pull Ethan Holloway's file again. All of it. The screening notes, the original application flag, everything." There was a pause. "Is everything? I also need to talk to Roy in facilities, not through HR. Just have him come up." "Understood," James said. "And James?" She stopped herself. "Yes?" "Cancel my 2 o'clock. I need the time." She hung up and sat very still for a moment, looking at the morning light crossing her floor. Then she opened the personnel note again and read, for the second time, the formal documentation of exactly what Derek Vaughn had felt it necessary to do to a janitor who had just saved the company $100 million. She read it carefully. She put the tablet down. She started thinking about what came next. Roy came up to the 42nd floor at 9:10, which was unusual enough that he'd changed into a clean shirt before coming. He He was a practical man, and he understood that when the CEO's assistant called you directly, you wore the clean shirt. Victoria met him in the small conference room adjacent to her office, not the main one. She had water on the table and didn't offer anything else, which Roy respected. He didn't need ceremony. "Tell me about Ethan Holloway," she said. Roy sat down carefully. He had the posture of a man deciding how honest to be, and Victoria watched him make the decision. "Good worker," Roy said. "Quiet. Does what you ask without needing it explain twice." "What else?" Roy turned his coffee cup around in his hands. He notices things, pointed out a bin placement issue in week 1 that we'd been ignoring for 2 years. Floor wax scheduling on 6, he caught that too. Small stuff. But he caught it. "Did you act on it?" "Both times." "Did you tell anyone where the suggestion came from?" Roy paused. "No." "Why not?" He looked at her steadily. "Because I didn't think anyone would care where it came from." Victoria nodded slowly. That was an honest answer, and she appreciated honest answers. "What did you think when you heard what happened in the conference room on Thursday?" Roy was quiet for a moment. "I thought it didn't surprise me," he said, "which is probably the thing that should bother me most." She thanked him and let him go. He stood at the door for a second, like he wanted to say something else, and then he left without saying it. James came in 4 minutes later with a folder. "Everything from the screening system on Holloway," he said. "The flag, the published papers, the doctoral enrollment record, and—" He hesitated. "He submitted a resignation this morning. Roy has it." Victoria looked at the window. "Where's it now?" "Still with Roy. He hasn't processed it yet."
"Tell Roy to hold it," she said. "Do not process it. Not until I say." James made a note. He was already moving toward the door when she said, "James, the papers. The ones he published at Alderton." "Yes?" "Find me someone who can explain them to me in plain language. Not an internal person. Someone outside." He understood what she was asking and why. "I'll find someone," he said.
The resignation letter sat on Roy's desk in a plain envelope with Ethan's name in the return corner, and Roy left it there without touching it the way you leave something you're not sure about on a shelf until you figure out what to do with it. Ethan, for his part, came in the next morning. He wasn't sure why entirely. He had written the letter. He meant it. But Sophie had asked him that morning if he was coming home at the same time, and he had said yes because he didn't know how to begin explaining what had changed, and so he had put on the uniform and taken the bus and clocked in. He moved through the morning route with the same rhythm as every other morning. Floor 3, floor 5. The break kitchen on 8, which had yesterday's catering spill along the baseboard and a coffee maker that leaked. He cleaned it methodically and submitted a request for the coffee maker and moved on. What he was doing, he understood, was buying time. Not for the job. The job was already finished in his mind. He was buying time to figure out how to tell Sophie. She had just made a friend at school, a girl named Priya, who had a dog and had invited Sophie over on Saturday. She had stopped mentioning Captain the Bear at bedtime with the same level of grief she'd brought to those mentions in the first 2 weeks. She was finding her footing. He didn't want to move her again. He didn't want to go back to Millhaven, which was the only alternative that made financial sense in the short term. He didn't want to have a conversation with a 7-year-old about why things had changed again. He was cleaning the water fountain alcove on 12 when Lucy found him.
"Roy wants you," she said. Her voice was careful. "His office." "Now?" "Now." He left the cart. He walked down to Roy's office. Roy was behind his desk with the same expression as someone who had been asked to referee something and wasn't thrilled about it. "Sit down," Roy said. Ethan sat. Roy picked up the envelope. He didn't open it. He just held it. "This yours?" "Yes." "I was told to hold it." Ethan looked at him. "By who?" Roy put the envelope back on his desk. He seemed to be choosing his words the way you choose your step on uncertain ground. "Above my pay grade," he said. "I'm just telling you, I'm holding it. That's all I know." He paused. "You still have your route today." Ethan looked at the envelope for a moment. "All right," he said. He went back to his cart. Derek Vaughn spent most of that morning working the phones. He had a particular skill, the kind that certain people develop over long careers in middle management, for building consensus around a position before anyone had formally taken one. He knew which board members deferred to operational expertise,
Which ones worried about liability? Which ones could be moved by the simple argument that rules existed for a reason, and the reason was order? He made 3 calls before noon. He framed it carefully, not as a grievance against an individual employee, but as a question of corporate security protocols and the risk of unvetted personnel accessing confidential workspaces. He didn't mention Ethan's name in 2 of the 3 calls. He didn't need to. The implication carried itself. What he was building was a file, not a formal complaint. He was too experienced for that. A file was too visible, too easy to challenge. What he was building was something softer and more durable, a shared understanding among people who mattered that there was a problem, that the problem had a shape, and that the shape happened to be a janitor who had embarrassed the engineering team by solving something they couldn't. He didn't think of it in those terms, of course. Derek Vaughan did not spend a lot of time examining his own motivations. He spent time examining situations and identifying what needed to happen for those situations to resolve in a way that felt like order. He made a 4th call after lunch to Philip in HR, asking about the timeline on the formal notation in Ethan's file. Philip told him the notation was in. Derek thanked him and hung up and went back to his afternoon. Ethan was on 31 late that afternoon, running the floor polisher along the north corridor when he heard voices coming from the secondary conference room. Not arguing, exactly, but the particular low-pitched urgency of a conversation that was trying not to be overheard. He wasn't trying to listen. The polisher was loud enough that he caught only fragments. But the door was slightly open, and 2 of the fragments were his name and the word liability, and that was enough to get the shape of what was happening. He finished the corridor. He put the polisher back on the cart. He thought about the envelope on Roy's desk. He thought about Sophie's butterfly drawing. He thought about Claire, briefly, the way he sometimes did when a decision was being made for him that he hadn't finished making himself. She had been very good at naming things clearly, not cruelly, but precisely. She had a gift for cutting through the way a situation was being framed and saying what it actually was. He thought she would probably say, "You already know what this is, you're just not ready to say it yet." He took the elevator down to facilities. Roy was still in his office. It was after 5, and Roy was one of those people who stayed until the work was done, which at Nexus meant he was usually the last one on his floor. Ethan stood in the doorway. "The letter," he said. Roy looked up. "I'm not withdrawing it," Ethan said, "but I need a couple more days." Roy considered this. He picked up a pen, put it down. 3 days, Roy said. "That's what I can hold it." "That's enough," Ethan said. "Thank you." Roy nodded and went back to whatever he'd been looking at. Ethan went to get his jacket and his bag and his bus pass and go home to his daughter. Sophie had made a card at school. She presented it to him at the door. She had apparently been waiting, which she denied when he pointed this out. But the card was in her hand and she was standing right inside the entrance, so the evidence was against her. The card was folded paper, purple crayon on the outside, and it said "Dad" in letters that she had made large and slightly uneven because she was in a phase of trying new lettering styles. Inside it said, "You are the smartest person and also you make good soup." "It's a compliment," she clarified, in case there was any ambiguity. "I know," he said. "Why did you make this?" She shrugged. "Ms. Holt said we should tell people things we appreciate because sometimes people don't know." He looked at the card for a moment. He thought about Ms. Holt and decided she was exactly the kind of teacher Sophie needed right now. "Thank you, Bug," he said. "You're welcome," she said, and immediately went back to what she'd been doing, which was apparently an argument with Captain the Bear about the rules of some game. He put the card on the kitchen counter where he could see it while he made dinner. Victoria spent the better part of 2 days going through everything. She had the outside consultant, a mathematics professor from Cartwright University named Dr. Okafor, who had been one of the people who had cited Ethan's Alderton papers in her own research, explain the published work to her in terms she could follow. Dr. Okafor did this over a video call with the particular enthusiasm of someone who had read the papers many times and still found them interesting. And when Victoria described the whiteboard solution and what the engineering team had verified, Dr. Okafor went quiet for a long moment. "He's been working as a janitor," Victoria said. Dr. Okafor took that in. "For how long?" "About 5 weeks. Before that, 12 years of various things." Another pause. "Why?" "That's what I'm trying to understand." She thanked Dr. Okafor and ended the call and pulled up Ethan's application again. She read the education section, the employment history, the sparse gap years. She looked at the address, which was in the Glenner district. She knew the Glenner district. She knew what rents were there. She called the HR director, a woman named Sandra, and asked her to compile what they had discreetly on the next of kin section of Ethan's onboarding file. Sandra called back 40 minutes later. Emergency contact is listed as Sophie Holloway, Sandra said. Relationship, daughter, age 7. A pause. No spouse listed. There's a note from the benefits enrollment that he asked specifically about the single-parent childcare supplement. Victoria thanked her. She sat with that for a while. She opened her own laptop rather than using the company system and searched Ethan Holloway, Millhaven, and then Ethan Holloway, Alderton, and then Claire Holloway, Millhaven, because she was building a picture, and some pictures have parts that can only be found by looking in the right places. The obituary came up on the third search. It was brief, small-town paper, the kind of obituary that gets written quickly by someone who loved the person and didn't have the distance yet to write well. Claire Holloway, née Reyes, 31, survived by her husband and daughter. A sentence about her work as an elementary school aide. A sentence about her laugh. Victoria read it twice. She closed the laptop. She sat at her desk with the 42nd floor around her and the city outside, and the particular weight of understanding something she hadn't understood before, which was not what had happened to Ethan Holloway, but what he had done with what happened to him. He had made a choice. Repeatedly, over years, he had made the same choice, not the one that rebuilt him, not the one that reclaimed what he'd given up for his parents and then again for Claire, but the one that put Sophie first, not because he'd given up, because he'd decided what was worth more. She sat with that for a long time. Then she called James and told him she needed Derek Vaughn in her office at 9 the following morning. No. Derek came in at 9 with the particular confidence of a man who had been in enough executive offices to not be intimidated by them. He sat without being asked, crossed one leg over the other, and said, "I appreciate you making time." Victoria looked at him. She had spent most of her leadership career learning to read people not by what they said, but by what they didn't know they were revealing. Derek was revealing right now that he thought this meeting was about alignment, that she had heard about the situation with the janitor and wanted to formalize the position from the top. That was not what this meeting was about. "Tell me what happened in your conversation with Ethan Holloway," she said. Derek gave her the version he had been refining for 3 days, measured, operational, grounded in language about protocol and clearance and institutional risk. He used the phrase chain of command twice. He was smooth. He had done this before. She let him finish. "He solved it," she said. "I'm sorry?" "He solved the problem, the logistics system. The engineers had been in that room for 6 hours. He walked by, looked at the board, and solved it in 90 seconds. I understand that," Derek said. "But the process—" "What process protected the company on Thursday?" she said. Her voice was level, not heated, just clear. Derek's expression shifted slightly. "Victoria, Ms. Ashcroft." A pause. He uncrossed his leg. "Ms. Ashcroft," he said, "I take your point, but if we allow any employee to walk into confidential sessions whenever they feel they have something to contribute, we create a precedent that—" "He knocked," she said. The door was opened. He borrowed a marker and wrote a solution on the board. Then he left. "He's a maintenance employee with no security clearance he has a mathematics background that most of our engineering team would need years to develop," she said. "He has published work that people in this industry have been citing for a decade. He turned down an analyst position and took a janitorial job because the hours meant he could pick up his 7-year-old daughter from school." She let that sit for a second. "What he doesn't have is your job title. That's the only thing he doesn't have that you do." Derek was quiet. "What I'm hearing," he said, more carefully now, "is that you want to offer him a different position." "What I want," she said, "is for you to explain to me why you spent 2 days making phone calls to board members about a maintenance employee." The shift in his face was small but unmistakable. She had expected he'd assume she wouldn't know about the calls. He had assumed correctly. She hadn't known about the calls, she'd guessed, based on 2 board members asking her, independently, whether there had been a security incident on 35. He looked at her steadily. He was a man who was used to winning this particular kind of confrontation by outlasting it. "I was managing information," he said. "That's part of my role." "Managing information?" she said. "And the formal notation in his HR file, and the meeting in your office with 2 other people as witnesses for what should have been, at most, A brief conversation about corridor protocols. Derek straightened. He violated. Stop, she said. He stopped. The room was quiet. She could hear the building's HVAC in the background, the low, constant hum of a large structure managing itself. We're done talking about that day, she said. I want to talk about what happens now. What I need to understand from you is whether you can work in a company that doesn't organize itself around job titles. He looked at her. She could see him deciding, the calculation of whether to push back or to agree provisionally and manage this from the outside. Of course, he said. That's always been my approach. She looked at him for a moment. All right, she said. Thank you for coming in. He stood, gathered himself, said something appropriate, and left. She turned to the window and sat quietly for a minute. She wasn't done with Derek Vaughn, but she had needed to look at him directly, and she had done that, and now she understood him more precisely than she had before, and that was what she needed. The second incident with Derek and Ethan happened on a Wednesday morning, 2 days after that meeting, and it was smaller than the first, but worse. In a way that small things can be worse, more deliberate, more personal, calculated to happen in a space where there were no witnesses who would think it worth reporting. Ethan was in the supply room on 9, restocking his cart, when Derek came in. There was no logistical reason for Derek to be in the supply room on 9. It was a small room with metal shelving and a utility sink and a smell of cleaning product that the ventilation only partially addressed. Derek stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he came in. You're still here, he said. Ethan didn't look up from the cart. Roy's holding my resignation. I know, Derek said. I also know why. He moved closer to the shelves, running one finger along the edge as if checking for dust, which was the most precisely pointed gesture he could have chosen in that room. You think she's going to fix this for you? Ethan pulled a bottle from the shelf. He added it to the cart. I don't think that, he said. Then what are you waiting for? Ethan looked at him. Not with anger, he was too tired for anger, and besides, anger would give Derek something to respond to, and Derek was the kind of man who thrived in responses. For my daughter to finish her week, he said. She's going to a friend's house Saturday. I don't want to change her plans. Derek looked at him. He had been expecting something else, argument, or defensiveness, or the particular wounded dignity of someone who felt they deserved better than this. He hadn't been expecting a 7-year-old's Saturday plans. He didn't know what to do with that, so he fell back on the only instrument he had. You don't belong here, he said. It wasn't loud. It was almost conversational. Ethan put the last item on the cart. He turned it around toward the door. Maybe, he said. He moved toward the door, which meant moving past Derek, and Derek didn't step back quite all the way. So for a second they were close enough that Ethan could see the particular blankness that certain people's faces go to when they've said the thing they came to say. Have a good morning, Ethan said, and pushed the cart out into the hallway. He did 2 more floors. He was somewhere in the middle of the bathroom, on 11, when his hand stopped moving, and he stood there for a second with a cloth in his hand and the fluorescent light buzzing overhead and thought, clearly and without drama, I am so tired. Not of the work, not of the hours, not even of Derek Vaughn. Just tired. The bone kind. The kind that accumulates across years of holding things together with both hands and not letting go because there is no one else holding the other side. He stood there for about 10 seconds. Then he finished the bathroom and went to the next room. Victoria found the notebook on a Thursday morning. She hadn't been looking for it. She was in the facilities wing because she had a meeting with Roy about the building's upcoming HVAC maintenance schedule. She did quarterly walkthroughs with department heads, had done it since her first month as CEO, because she believed in knowing the whole building and not just the floor she worked on. Roy had been mid-sentence about the unit on 17 when his phone rang and he'd stepped out, and Victoria had been left standing in his small office, and she had looked around because that was what she did when she was in a new space. The notebook was on Roy's desk. It wasn't Ethan's main notebook. That one he kept in his bag. This was a smaller one, a pocket-sized spiral bound that he'd left behind last week when Roy had called him in for the conversation about the resignation letter. Victoria had seen it sitting there and thought nothing of it then. Now, standing alone in Roy's office, she picked it up. She almost put it down immediately. It wasn't hers. She didn't make a habit of reading things that weren't hers. But the first page was open, and what was on it stopped her. It wasn't equations. Not exactly. It was a map, A layout of the Nexus building's first 18 floors, hand-drawn from memory, annotated with small, precise notes. Cleaning schedule gaps, foot traffic patterns, a proposed route adjustment that would cut the morning turnaround by 22 minutes. 3 different handwritten calculations in the margin, checking the time estimates from different angles. She turned the page. This page was equations, but they were structured in a way she hadn't seen, layered, annotated, with small side notes that read like a conversation he was having with himself. This assumes constant load, check buffer timing when variable, and see what happens if the base condition changes. Does the correction still hold? He had been continuing to work on the logistics problem after solving it, not because anyone asked him to, because his mind hadn't let it go. She stood in Roy's office and turned pages. There were observations about process inefficiency in the vendor contract cycle, written in the same small, unhurried hand. There was a scheduling model for custodial resource allocation across a building the size of Nexus, built from scratch because presumably no such model existed yet. There were fragments of something that looked like it might eventually become a completely new approach to certain kinds of load balancing problems, except it was annotated in the margins with, "Not sure this is right yet. Come back." There were also, on the last several pages she looked at, a grocery list, a note about Sophie's school schedule for the following month, a phone number with Marcus written next to it, and a drawing of a cat that Sophie had apparently contributed, signed in the bottom corner with a backward S. Victoria stood in Roy's office for a long moment. Roy came back. He stopped when he saw her with the notebook. "That's Ethan's," he said. "I know," she said. She put it down. "He left it here. Last week. I've been meaning to get it back to him." Roy looked at her. "You read it?" "Some of it." Roy was quiet for a moment. He was a man who understood things without needing them explained. He picked up the notebook and put it in his desk drawer. "He's a good worker," Roy said. "Roy," she said. "Do you know why he really came here? Not the hours, not the daughter. Why Nexus specifically?" Roy thought about it honestly. "No," he said. She nodded. She went to her meeting, but she spent the rest of the morning thinking about a man who had been working before sunrise every day, solving problems no one asked him to solve, writing it all down in a notebook he never showed anyone, and going home every evening to cook dinner for his daughter. She thought about what it cost a person to compress that much of themselves into that small a space. To fold a mind like his down into a morning shift in a cleaning cart and a blue uniform with your name over the pocket. She thought about what it meant that he was still doing it, not because he had no other choice, but because somewhere in the accounting he had done quietly by himself, the math had come out the same way it always did. She got back to her office. James was at his desk outside. "James," she said, "get me Ethan Holloway's home address." James looked up. "Is this personal visit?" she said. "This weekend, not company business." He made a note. He knew better than to ask more. She went into her office and closed the door and looked at the city and thought about what she was going to say to a man who had already decided to leave, when the thing she needed him to understand was that the version of Nexus that had treated him the way it had was not the company she was running, that the failure wasn't his, and the cost of that failure shouldn't be his to carry either. She wasn't sure she could say it in a way that would land, but she was going to try. The Saturday morning of Sophie's visit to Priya's house arrived with the particular cruelty of good weather on a day when Ethan had something difficult to think about. The sky was clear, the temperature had climbed out of its recent freeze, and Sophie stood at the apartment door at 9:45 in her good jacket with Captain tucked under one arm because she had decided Captain should meet Priya's dog. "Captain might scare the dog," Ethan said. "Captain is not scary. Captain is missing an eye." "That makes him interesting," Sophie said, with the authority of someone who had considered this argument before and already won it in her head. He walked her the 4 blocks to Priya's building and met Priya's mother, a warm, slightly harried woman named Divya, who had flower on her sleeve and the manner of someone who regularly had more children in her apartment than she had planned for and had made peace with it. She told Ethan Sophie was welcome to stay through lunch. He gave her his number and said he'd be back by 2. He walked home slowly. The apartment without Sophie in it was a different kind of space, not lonely exactly. He had lived alone before, in the years before Claire, in the years that felt like a previous draft of himself, but quiet in a way that let things surface that the daily routine kept submerged. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table. He looked at the butterfly drawing above Sophie's door. He'd been going back and forth about the decision for 5 days, in the way that you go back and forth about something when you've already made it, but you don't want to finish making it. He knew what the situation was. He knew what Derek was building and what it would eventually produce. Not a firing, nothing so direct, but a slow erosion. More formal notations, more conversations with witnesses. The particular institutional pressure that certain people knew how to apply until the situation resolved itself without anyone having to be accountable for resolving it. He also knew that Victoria had held his resignation letter. He didn't know what that meant exactly, and he was trying not to build a structure of meaning on something that might just be administrative delay. He was still sitting at the table, coffee going cold, when the buzzer rang.
He wasn't expecting anyone. Mrs. Tran sometimes brought food on weekends, but she knocked rather than buzzing because she had a key. He went to the intercom. Yes? Ethan. A pause. It's Victoria. Victoria Ashcroft. I should have called first. I'm sorry. I can go if this isn't... He pressed the door release before she finished the sentence.
He stood in the apartment for the 15 seconds it took to hear the elevator. The building had one, old and slow. And looked at the kitchen table and the dishes and the drying rack and the butterfly drawing and Sophie's shoes kicked off near the door. And then he heard the elevator open and footsteps and the soft friction of wheels on the hallway floor. He opened the door before she knocked. She was in a gray coat, no Nexus branding, no assistant. Her hair was down, which he had never seen at the office. She looked, for the first time since he'd encountered her in that building, like someone who was not performing a role. She also looked tired, in the way that people with significant responsibility look tired on their days off. Like the weight doesn't stop even when the context changes. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. "Come in." He stepped back. She came through the door, taking in the apartment with the brief, genuine attention of someone who was actually looking rather than cataloging. The small kitchen, the table with the cold coffee, Sophie's shoes, the butterfly drawing. "Is this a bad time?" she asked. "Sophie's at a friend's. I have until 2. "I won't need that long." She turned her chair to face him. "I wanted to do this in person, not at the office." He pulled one of the kitchen chairs out and sat down, which brought them closer to eye level. He'd noticed early in working at Nexus that a lot of people talked to Victoria from a standing position without thinking about it, and that she had learned to navigate this and never mentioned it. He thought that said something about both the people and her. "You don't have to explain why you came," he said. "I want to," she said. "I read the notebook." He was quiet for a moment. "Roy's office." "It was open. I should have put it down." She met his eyes. "I didn't." "What did you see?" "Everything you've been working on. The scheduling model, the logistics continuation, the process observations, all of it." She paused. "Ethan, you've been doing the work of 3 people without being asked and without telling anyone." "I do it for myself," he said. "My brain doesn't stop. It never has." "I know," she said. "I remember." That landed in the room between them. The weight of knowing someone from a previous version of both their lives, before the wheelchair, and before Claire, and before Sophie, and before all the distance a decade puts between who you were and who you became. "The solution on the whiteboard," she said. "Dr. Okafor at Cartwright. She explained it to me. She said most people in her department would need a week with that problem, possibly more." "It was visible," he said, "once you know what to look for." The engineers in that room had been in it for 6 hours. They were looking at the wrong layer. She looked at him steadily. "You're not going to let me say it, are you?" He almost smiled. "Say what?" "That what you did was remarkable." He looked at the table. He turned the coffee cup around in his hands. "What I did," he said, "got me a formal notation in my HR file and Derek Vaughn in the supply room telling me I don't belong there." She didn't look away from that. "I know about the supply room," she said. He looked up. "Roy told me. Lucy told Roy." She said it simply, not as an apology, just as a fact. "I had a conversation with Derek." "What kind of conversation?" "The kind where I asked him to account for his choices, and he gave me practiced answers, and I listened very carefully to the difference between what he said and what he meant." Ethan studied her. She had always been like this, he remembered. Precise, not cold, but precise. The kind of person who prepared for a conversation by deciding exactly what information she needed from it, and then built everything around that. I'm not going to pretend it's fixed, she said. I want to be honest with you about that. There are board members who have been spoken to. Derek is a practiced operator, and he has relationships I can't just override by memo.
What I'm dealing with is real, and it's going to take time. Victoria, he said quietly. I submitted my resignation. I know. Roy can only hold it 3 days. That's today. I know that too, she said. I'm asking you not to make the decision yet. That's why I'm here. She paused. And because I owe you an apology on behalf of this company, and I wanted to do it in person. He looked at her. You don't owe me an apology, he said. The company does. I run the company. She said it simply, not as performance. You walked into that building with every qualification we could want, and you took a job pushing a mop because you needed hours that worked with your daughter's school schedule, and the first time your actual capability showed itself, She stopped. We responded with formal notations and supply room confrontations. That's not the company I'm trying to build. He was quiet. He could hear the radiator in Sophie's room, the one that knocked all night, and that Sophie had named Gerald after the HR manager because she had overheard Ethan mention the name and found it funny. Why did you come to Nexus? She asked. Specifically. He looked at the table. The hours, he said. Ethan. He turned the cup around again. It was a habit he had. The turning, not fidgeting, just a way of slowing his hands down while his mind was doing something. I've read your annual reports, he said finally, since you took over. The logistics restructure in Q2, the supply chain modeling they published last year. Whoever is doing your systems architecture, he paused. There are patterns in the way those problems are being approached that are interesting, that are not standard. She was very still. You came because the math was interesting, she said. That sounds smaller than it is. No, she said. It doesn't. Ma, she looked at him for a moment. And the janitor position. He exhaled. I need to be home at 3:30, he said. That's not negotiable. Sophie gets off the school van and she needs someone to be there. I can't take a job that has evening meetings and quarterly travel and the kind of schedule that executive work actually runs on. He paused. This wasn't a stepping stone. I knew what I was applying for. She absorbed this. What if, she said carefully, there was a position that didn't have those constraints? He looked at her. I'm not going to offer you something right now, she said. I'm not here to do that today. I'm here because I read the notebook and I spoke with Derek, and I needed you to know that what happened to you inside that building is not the version of Nexus I'm going to leave standing. She stopped. And I need you to give me the time to deal with what I have to deal with. A week, maybe 2. He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about Derek in the supply room. He thought about the envelope on Roy's desk. He thought about Sophie's butterfly drawing. My daughter comes first, he said. Whatever you're thinking about, whatever you're building toward, if it puts pressure on that, I'll walk before it becomes a conversation. I understand, she said. I mean that literally, not as a negotiating position. I know, she said. I know you mean it literally. They looked at each other. Outside, a siren moved past, 2 blocks over, fading. Okay, he said. She let out a breath. Not dramatic, just the quiet kind. The release of something she'd been holding since she'd buzzed from the lobby. I'll be in touch through Roy, she said. Not company channels. That works. She moved toward the door and he held it, and she paused in the doorway for a second. The notebook, she said. The scheduling model for custodial allocation. Did you run any cost analysis on it? He looked at her. He hadn't expected that question. Rough numbers. Maybe 30% reduction in man-hours over a full building implementation if the route timing holds. She nodded slowly. I thought so, she said. And then she was gone. What happened next happened faster than Victoria had expected, and in a shape she hadn't fully anticipated, which was the thing about Derek Vaughn. He was predictable in his motivations and unpredictable in his timing. The board meeting was on a Tuesday. It was a quarterly review, standard format, and Victoria had been preparing for it for 2 weeks. Financials, operational outlook, the HVAC maintenance budget that Roy had been lobbying for, the Q4 projections from the analytics team, a full agenda. What she hadn't known was that Derek had arranged, through 2 board members he'd been cultivating, to add an item to the agenda under Organizational Risk and Compliance Review. It was placed 4th after the financials,
which meant it would hit when everyone's attention was still high and before the post-lunch dip. She found out at 8:30 on Tuesday morning when James brought her the updated agenda. She read it once. She set it down. She picked it up and read it again.
"When was this added?" she said. "Yesterday evening," James said, "after you'd left." She looked at the item. Security protocol compliance. Unauthorized personnel access to restricted sessions. No names, no specifics, just the language, which would do the work of suggesting specifics to anyone in the room who'd been receiving Derek's phone calls. She thought about calling it, pulling the item, using her authority as chair to restructure the agenda. She could do it. She had the standing. She thought about that for 30 seconds. Then she put the agenda down. "James," she said, "I need you to pull everything from the Thursday incident, the engineering team's verification report, the system recovery timeline, the financial impact estimate from the CTO's office. I need it in a folder before 11. "I have most of that already." "Good. I also need the personnel file." She paused. "All of it. Not just Nexus records." "That's outside, huh?" "What's publicly available?" she said. "The Alderton research record, the published work, the doctoral enrollment. What Dr. Okafor sent me. None of it is confidential." James made a note. "One more thing," she said. "Get me the HR records on Derek's departmental management. Formal complaints, informal notations, anything in the system." He looked up. "I'm not building a file," she said. "I'm reading one that already exists, and I just haven't looked at it closely enough." He nodded and went to work. Quote, she had read everything by 10:45. She sat in her office and looked at the city and thought through the board meeting the way she thought through every high-stakes meeting. Not as performance, but as a problem with a structure. And structures had load-bearing points. And if you found the load-bearing points, you knew where to apply pressure. Derek's play was elegant in its simplicity. The board meeting created a formal record, a compliance discussion entered into minutes that established a documented concern about an individual who was not yet named, but would be, in subsequent conversations, made identifiable. Once that record existed, Victoria's ability to defend Ethan within the company's own governance structure became complicated. She would be seen as overriding a board-level concern for personal reasons, and personal reasons were always available to be reframed. It was the kind of move that worked well when the person on the other side didn't know it was coming. She knew it was coming. She also knew something else, which was that Derek had made an error, not in the move itself, but in the timeline. He had moved too quickly before he'd fully consolidated the board. 2 members were already aligned with him. The other 4 were not. They were open, which meant they were persuadable, and the meeting was the persuasion. She had one job in that room, be the first one to name what was actually happening. The board meeting convened at 1. The financials took 40 minutes and ran slightly long because 2 board members had questions about the Q4 modeling. Victoria answered them directly and without defensiveness, which was how she always handled financial questions, and moved them through it. Derek's item came up at 2:12. He introduced it with a practice neutrality, framing it as a process question, an opportunity to review the company's clearance protocols in the wake of a recent incident. He did not name Ethan. He used phrases like unauthorized personnel and sensitive session integrity and institutional risk framework. He was smooth, and Victoria let him be smooth because she needed the board to hear all of it, to sit with the full shape of what was being proposed before she said anything. When he finished, there was the brief silence that boardrooms get when someone has said something that sounds reasonable and everyone is deciding how much it actually is. Victoria said, "I want to make sure we're talking about the same incident." Derek looked at her. "Thursday, 3 weeks ago," she said. "The core logistics system failure. Is that what this is about?" "The incident in question," Derek started. "Let me just put some numbers in the room," she said. "The CTO's office estimated that a full system failure without recovery would have cost us somewhere between $80 and $110 million in immediate losses, plus contract penalties and the downstream effects on Q1 projections. I can have James distribute that estimate if it would help." She looked around the table. The system recovered. It recovered because of a solution that was produced in approximately 90 seconds after 6 hours of failure. The room was quiet. "The solution was written on the whiteboard in the conference room by a member of our building maintenance team," she said. "His name is Ethan Holloway. He has a bachelor's in mathematics from Alderton University and doctoral-level research training. He has published work in computational logistics that has been cited 41 times by researchers whose methods are currently industry standard.
He is working a morning cleaning shift because the hours allow him to be home when his 7-year-old daughter gets out of school. She paused. He knocked on the door of that conference room and asked to borrow a marker. The silence had a different quality now. One of the board members, a woman named Christine, who ran the audit committee and had a reputation for going very still when she was thinking hard, said, "And the compliance concern is that he entered the room." The compliance concern, Derek said, recovering, is that our protocols for restricted session access. He saved us $100 million, Christine said. She said it the way you say an obvious thing when you need it on the record. The protocols exist for a reason, Derek said. If we establish that any employee can enter any session when they believe they have something to contribute, that's not what happened, Victoria said. What happened is that a man with extraordinary capability walked past a room where a problem he could solve was displayed on a whiteboard, and he made a judgment call. And the judgment call was correct. She looked at Derek directly. The question I'd like the board to consider is what we do with that, not what we do about it. She let that sit. One of the other board members, older, a man named Harold, who had been on the board since before Victoria's tenure and who had a way of saying very little and meaning a great deal, said, "What are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that we table the compliance item," she said, "and that we have a separate conversation about how this company identifies and uses the talent that's already inside it." She looked at Harold. If we had known, when we hired him, what Ethan Holloway was capable of, we wouldn't have put him in a janitorial role. "But we did," Harold said. "We did," she agreed. And then when his capability showed itself in a crisis, the company's first response was a formal HR notation and a meeting in Derek's office with witnesses. She was still looking at Harold. "I think the board should know that." Harold looked at Derek. Derek's expression had not moved in a way that showed anything specific. He had been in rooms like this before. He knew how to sit still under pressure. "Is that accurate?" Harold said to Derek. "There was a formal conversation, yes. Protocol required. There were witnesses," Harold said. "You brought in witnesses." "For documentation purposes. For a maintenance employee who knocked on a door," Christine said. There was something in her voice that had shifted. Not anger, just the precise coldness of someone who was done being moved. Derek looked around the table. He was still controlled, but something underneath the control had shifted. The particular sensation of a man who has played a move and watched the board respond in a way he hadn't modeled. "I acted in the best interest of the company," he said. "I believe you thought so," Victoria said, and she meant it, which was the thing that made it land the way it did. Not as an attack, but as an assessment. The compliance item was tabled. The vote was 4-2. After the meeting, in the hallway outside the boardroom, Harold came alongside her and said quietly, "You should have come to us earlier." "I know," she said. "I was still gathering information." He considered this. "And now?" "Now I know what I need to know," she said. He nodded once and walked on. Victoria went back to her office. She sat at her desk and felt not triumph. She didn't trust triumph. It was the emotion most likely to make you sloppy, but something more like the settling of a structure that had been under load. The boards had held. The weight was still there, but it was distributed now, and distribution was manageable. She still had Derek to deal with. Tabling the item was not resolving the person, and she knew the difference. She also still had a conversation to have with Ethan Holloway, and that one was more complicated than anything the board had presented, because it required something the board didn't. It required him to want it. She went back to the HR records that evening, in her office after everyone else had gone. The records on Derek's management history were what she had expected in form, and worse than she'd expected in content. 3 informal complaints over 4 years, none of them escalated. 2 from women in his department, 1 from a junior manager who had transferred out 6 months after filing the note. The complaints described the same profile: dismissive in private, scrupulously professional in formal settings, with a particular consistency in who he chose to target. The targets were always people with less institutional standing, always people who would have something to lose by pressing a complaint. She read all 3 complaints in full. She sat with them for a while. She had known, walking into the CEO role, that there would be people like Derek in the company, people who had built themselves into the institution and who treated that position as a kind of tenure. She had expected to deal with that eventually. She had not expected it to show itself this way, over this particular person, in this particular week. She made a note in her own document, not Derek's file, her own. and then she called legal. The call to Roy came through on a Thursday morning. Roy answered it, which was already unusual because the number that came through belonged to Victoria's private cell, and Roy had not known she had his personal number. "Roy," she said, "is Ethan on shift?" "Started at 6, Roy said. "Can you ask him to come up to 42 at 10? Not through the company line. Just tell him yourself." "I can do that," Roy said. He found Ethan on 9, cleaning the windows in the east corridor. He relayed the message without commentary. Ethan stood with the window cloth in his hand for a moment. "What floor?" he said. 42, Roy said. "Her office." Ethan nodded. He went back to the window. He finished the glass he was on, because he finished what he started, and then he put the cloth away and moved to the next. At 9:58, he rode the elevator to 42. James was at his desk. He looked up when Ethan came in, and there was something in his expression, not pity, just a kind of careful attention, the look of someone who had watched a situation develop and knew he was seeing a significant moment in it. "She's expecting you," James said. "Go ahead." Ethan knocked once and opened the door. Victoria was at her desk, with the east window behind her and the morning light coming in at the angle that made the office feel warmer than it was. She had a folder open in front of her. She closed it when he came in. "Sit down," she said. He pulled a chair over and sat. She looked at him for a second. Then she said, "The board meeting was Tuesday." "I heard," he said. "Roy." The compliance item was tabled, 4-2. He nodded. "I want to tell you what I told them," she said, "because it involved you and you should hear it from me directly." She told him. She didn't edit it or shape it. She told him what she had said about the logistics system and the financial exposure and his background and what had happened in the conference room and then what had happened afterward. She told him about the HR notation and the 2 witnesses. She said Derek's name. He listened. He didn't interrupt. His expression was the careful neutral of someone who had learned to receive difficult information without reacting visibly, which was a skill that came from years of receiving it. When she finished, he said, "What happens to Derek?" She looked at him directly. "That's being handled through a separate process." He read what that meant without her saying it. "I didn't come here to cause that," he said. "I know," she said. "It wasn't caused by you. It was caused by what was already in the records and by what he did." He was quiet for a moment. "You said last weekend you weren't going to offer me anything yet," he said. "I'm not," she said. "Not today. I want to show you something first." She turned her laptop to face him. On the screen was a document, a role description, drafted but not finalized, titled Internal Consultant, Systems and Methodology. He leaned forward slightly and read it. It was not an executive role. It had no direct reports, no budget authority, no formal title in the organizational hierarchy. What it had was scope, the ability to sit in on any engineering session, any operational review, any systems discussion in the building, and to contribute and to teach. It had office hours with the junior engineering staff. It had protected time for independent work. The hours were 6-2, Monday through Friday. He read it twice. "You wrote this around me," he said. "I wrote it for the company," she said, "which, at this moment, are the same thing." He leaned back. He looked at the window. "The pay," he said. She told him the number. He looked at her. "That's not a consultant's salary," he said. "It's what the work is worth," she said. He was quiet for a long time. She didn't fill the silence, which she was good at, sitting with silence, letting it be what it was without rushing through it. "I need to talk to Sophie," he said finally. "Of course," she said. "Not to get her permission," he said. "She's 7. She doesn't give permission, but she's going to be affected by this, and she should know before I decide." Victoria looked at him. She thought about what it said about a man, that the person he needed to consult was a child who he was also clear-eyed enough to acknowledge couldn't actually make the decision, that the consultation was about dignity, Sophie's dignity, the dignity of being someone whose life was considered even when you were 7 and couldn't vote on it. "Take whatever time you need," she said. He stood. He looked at the laptop screen one more time, at the role description, at the hours. 6-2, he said. 6-2, she confirmed. He nodded once, and then he went back to work. He didn't tell Sophie that night. He made dinner, pasta with the jarred sauce she liked, the one with the green label, because it was Thursday, and Thursday was pasta night. And routine was one of the few things he'd found that made a 7-year-old feel like the world was stable even when it wasn't. She talked about school. She had a project coming up on weather systems and had already decided that tornadoes were the most interesting weather system and was mildly offended that Ms. Holt had suggested she consider other options. Tornadoes are objectively the best, Sophie said. What makes weather objectively good? Ethan asked. She considered this with the particular seriousness she brought to questions that she sensed were trying to trap her. Power, she said finally. And the spinning. Strong argument. I know. After dinner, after the dishes, after the 30-minute reading time that Sophie took seriously because she was in a chapter book about a girl who talked to horses, and the horses were apparently more interesting than anything else currently happening in Sophie's life. After all of that, he sat on the edge of her bed while she settled Captain into the specific arrangement Captain required, and he said, "Can I talk to you about something?" She looked at him. 7-year-olds had a particular radar for tone. She sat up a little. "Is it bad?" she said. "No," he said. "I don't think so. I want to know what you think." He told her in the way you tell a 7-year-old important things, not simplified exactly, but stripped of the bureaucratic scaffolding. He told her that the job he had might be changing, that there was a different job he'd been offered, still at the same building, and that the hours were the same. He would still be home before she got off the school van, but that other things would be different. He would be doing different work. He would be around different people. Sophie listened to all of this with the focused expression she used when she was doing mental math. "Would you have to wear a different uniform?" she asked. He hadn't thought about that. "Probably not a uniform," he said. "Just regular clothes?" "Just regular clothes." She thought about this. "Do you want the different job?" He looked at her. This was the question he'd been asking himself for 3 days in various forms, and from his daughter's mouth it had the directness of something obvious that he'd been making complicated. "I think so," he said, "but I wanted to know if it's okay with you." "Why would it not be okay with me?" "It's a change," he said. "We've had a lot of those lately." Sophie looked at Captain. She adjusted one of his ears. She had the expression of someone doing serious consideration. "Dad," she said, "I don't care about the job. I care about you being home when I get home." "That stays the same," he said. "That doesn't change." "Then it's fine," she said. She lay down and pulled the blanket up. "You should take the job that's better. That's what Ms. Holt says. She says you should always try the harder thing." "Ms. Holt is smart," he said. "I know," Sophie said, with the tone of someone who had believed this for some time. He turned off the light. He stood in the doorway for a second, looking at her in the dark, at the small shape of her under the blanket and Captain's worn silhouette tucked against her. "Hey, Bug," he said. "What?" "You're going to be okay, you know, whatever happens." A pause, then, "I know, Dad. Go to bed." He went to bed. He lay in the dark for a while. He thought about the role description on Victoria's laptop, the 6 to 2 hours, the number she had said with the particular steadiness of someone who was not negotiating. He thought about the scheduling model in his notebook, the logistics continuation, the things his brain had been doing in the margins of every day for 7 weeks. He thought about what it had cost him, over the years, to keep those things in the margins. Not in a self-pitying way. He was not a self-pitying man. It had never been a productive use of time. Just honestly. The way you account for something because it's real, not because you want sympathy for it. He fell asleep before he'd finished deciding, which was probably the most honest decision he could have made. In the morning, he called Roy before his shift and told him to process the resignation. Then he called Roy back 4 minutes later and told him to hold it one more day. Roy, to his considerable credit, said nothing except okay both times. Shut. He went to the 42nd floor at 7:15 the next morning, before the building had fully populated, when the elevator traffic was still light, and the executive corridor had the particular quiet of a space not yet occupied by the day's business. James was already at his desk. James was always already at his desk. "She's in," James said without looking up. "Is she?" "Go ahead," James said. He knocked. She said, "Come in." She was at her desk with coffee and a tablet, in the half-focused state of someone who had been working for a while and was not entirely back from wherever the work had taken her. She looked up when he came in, and the focus sharpened. "I'll take the position," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Something in her face shifted. Not surprised, she had been expecting one of two answers, but something more like the quiet acknowledgement of something that had been uncertain resolving into something that was settled. "Okay," she said. "I have conditions." "Tell me." He sat down. He hadn't planned to go through them in order, but they came out that way, which was probably how his brain had organized them in the night. "The hours are fixed," he said. "I understand operational demands, and I'm willing to be flexible within a window. If something is genuinely critical, I can stay until 4. But 4 is the ceiling, every day, not most days." "Agreed," she said. "I don't want a title that implies I'm above the engineering team. I'm not their manager. I don't want them to feel like I'm evaluating them. The role description doesn't include a management function." "I know what the description says. I'm telling you how I want it communicated to them." She nodded. "I'll handle the introduction myself." "Third," he said, "Roy." She waited. "Roy is a good facilities manager. What happened in the last 2 months, the notebook, the scheduling model, the route adjustment suggestions, none of that should land on Roy as a performance problem. He ran his department well. If anything, he ran it better than before I got there." Victoria looked at him. "Is there a reason you think Roy is at risk?" "I don't know that he is," Ethan said. "I just want to say it clearly. Whatever gets restructured because of my move, Roy's department doesn't suffer for having had me in it." She was quiet for a moment. "I'll make sure of that." "Last thing," he said. She waited again. He noticed she was good at waiting. She didn't fill the gaps, didn't prompt, just held the space until he was ready. He'd noticed that in her at Alderton, too. It was the kind of patience that wasn't passive, just disciplined. If Derek Vaughn is still in this building in a role where he can do what he did, in this building or any building, then the position doesn't work, he said. Not because I'm afraid of him. Because if the people I'm supposed to be helping watch me walk in and then watch him stay, I won't be able to do anything useful. They'll see exactly what this company's hierarchy actually values, and it won't be me. The room was quiet. "That's being addressed," she said carefully. "How?" She looked at him for a moment, deciding what to share. "There are 3 formal complaints in Derek's HR record that were never escalated," she said. 2 from women in his department, 1 from a junior manager. I've asked legal to review them. That review is separate from anything related to you. It would have happened regardless." She paused. "What he did in the supply room, what he built around the board meeting, that becomes part of that review, but not the center of it." Ethan absorbed this. "When?" he said. "End of next week at the outside," she said. He nodded. He looked at the window. The morning light was doing its thing again, the same angle as when he'd come in with the maintenance cart 2 months ago, and she had looked at him from the elevator hallway and said his name, like it was something she'd been holding on to. "All right," he said. She extended her hand across the desk. He shook it. It was not a grand moment. It was an ordinary handshake between 2 people who had just made an agreement that both of them knew was more complicated than any agreement usually was. Her grip was firm. His was too. "Monday," she said. 8 o'clock. James will have your building access updated." 8 works, he said. And then, "Thank you." "Don't," she said. You earned it. That's different." He stood. At the door he paused, and without entirely planning to, said, "The scheduling model in the notebook. For custodial resource allocation." She looked at him. "It's not finished," he said, "but if Roy wants to implement it, I can have it ready in a week." Something crossed her face that might have been the beginning of a smile. "I'll tell him to expect it." Ethan nodded and left. He went back to his cart. He had 3 hours left on his last shift and he intended to finish them. Bus. The news about Derek moved through the building the way significant personnel news always moved. Not announced, just suddenly present, the way a change in air pressure is present before a storm. By Wednesday of the following week, people were filling in the shape of it from the edges, the way you reconstruct a picture from context when you don't have the centerpiece. What the company officially received was a memo from HR noting that Derek Vaughn was transitioning out of his role effective immediately, and that the operations management function would be covered by an interim structure pending a search. The memo was professional and said nothing that could be used for anything. What people actually understood was that Derek was gone, and that the timeline placed it squarely in the aftermath of the board meeting and the question of the janitor who had saved the logistics system, and that the CEO had been involved, and that the formal complaints that had been sitting undisturbed in the HR system for 4 years had not been undisturbed after all. Lucy heard it from Philip, who was not supposed to say anything but was a person who processed his own discomfort by talking, and Lucy told the custodial team in the break room on 9 with the particular satisfaction of someone who had been waiting a long time for the weather to change. "He's gone," she said. "As of when?" someone asked. "Tuesday close," she said. The room absorbed this. Someone poured more coffee. Someone said quietly, "About time." And nobody argued with that. Roy heard it from the HR director herself, who called him as a professional courtesy because Derek's departure affected the contract management chain, and Roy was part of that chain. Roy listened, said, "I see," 3 times, and thanked her. He hung up and sat at his desk for a minute. Then he opened his desk drawer and looked at the pocket notebook that was still in there, Ethan's, the one he'd been meaning to return, and he put it in his jacket pocket to give back on Monday. Ethan spent the weekend doing ordinary things. He took Sophie to the farmer's market on Saturday morning, which she had recently discovered, and which she approached with the systematic enthusiasm of someone building a database. She had a system. First pass was reconnaissance, second pass was acquisition. He followed her through both passes, carrying the bag, eating a sample of something with honey in it that a vendor offered him. "Is it good?" Sophie asked. "It's very sweet," he said. "That's not an answer. It's a description." She gave him the look she gave him when she suspected he was being technically accurate as a way of avoiding a position. She bought a small jar of the honey with her own money, which was money she had been accumulating from a chart system she'd invented that assigned point values to household tasks. He had agreed to the chart system in a moment of exhausted parental innovation, and it had turned out to be more successful than he'd expected, which meant he now owed Sophie 67 cents a week, and she was saving towards something she hadn't yet named. On Sunday, he cleaned the apartment, really cleaned it, not the maintenance mode version, and reorganized the kitchen cabinets, which had been functional but illogical since they'd moved in. He found, behind a mug he hadn't used, a photograph that had been in a box and that he'd apparently put in the cabinet without fully registering where he was putting it. It was Claire at 28, at a picnic somewhere, laughing at something off camera. She had her hand up to shade her eyes, and she was laughing so hard she was a little blurry. He held it for a moment. He was not, he thought, a man who handled grief in any particularly clean or recognized way. He didn't go through stages in order. He didn't achieve closure, whatever that meant. What he had done was carry it, the way you carry something heavy when there is no place to set it down. You adjust your grip, you redistribute the weight, you keep moving because stopping is not an option. Sophie came into the kitchen and saw the photograph and said, "That's Mom." "Yeah," he said. She looked at it. She's laughing. She was always laughing at something. Sophie took the photograph from him, carefully, and looked at it for a longer moment than he expected. Then she said, "Can we put it up?" "Where?" "In the living room," she said, "on that shelf that doesn't have anything on it." He looked at the shelf. She was right. He'd never put anything on it, partly because they hadn't fully unpacked, partly because he hadn't decided what went where, partly because shelves were the kind of decision he'd been deferring. "Yeah," he said, "we can do that." Sophie put the photograph on the shelf herself, adjusted it twice, stepped back and examined the result. "Good," she pronounced, and went back to her chapter book. Ethan looked at the photograph on the shelf for a minute. The blurry laughing woman, the light she'd been shading against. He went back to reorganizing the cabinet. Monday arrived without ceremony, which is how significant days usually arrive. He was up at 5:30, not the 5 that the janitorial shift had required, but he'd been waking at 5 for 2 months and the body doesn't adjust quickly. He made coffee. He looked at the photograph on the shelf. He checked Sophie's bag for the 3rd time, which was 1 time more than necessary, but a habit he hadn't broken. He wore his own clothes, dark pants, a gray shirt he'd had for 4 years and kept in good condition, the good jacket over it. He looked in the bathroom mirror for a moment, not vain, just checking, the way you check before something matters. He looked like himself. He looked tired. He looked, he thought, like a man who was about to do something unfamiliar and was choosing not to be afraid of it. Sophie came out of her room at 7 with her hair uncombed and captain under her arm and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at him. "You look different," she said. "Different how?" She studied him. Not the uniform, she said, as if confirming a diagnosis. No, he said. Not the uniform. She processed this.
Are you nervous? A little. She nodded seriously. Ms. Holt says nervous means you care. It's okay to be nervous. Ms. Holt, he said, should write a book. I'll tell her, Sophie said, and went to find her hairbrush. He walked her to the van at 7:45. She climbed in, got her seatbelt, turned back to give him a wave that was businesslike in its efficiency. She was at the age where prolonged goodbyes were embarrassing, and the van pulled away. He stood on the sidewalk and watched it go. Then he took the bus to the Nexus building and walked through the front doors at 7:58. James had the access card ready. He handed it over with the same calm efficiency he brought to everything and said, "Room 407's been set up for you. It's small. We're working on something larger, but for now it's yours." Ethan looked at the card. His name was on it, and under his name the designation, Systems Consultant. No floor restriction. Full building access. "Victoria wants to see you at 9, James said. She's doing an all-staff message this morning." "What kind of message?" "She'll tell you herself," James said. "Get settled first." Room 407 was on the 4th floor, which was neither executive nor facilities, it was the mid-building zone, analytics and operations research, and a few functions that didn't have natural homes elsewhere. The room was, as James had said, small. A desk, a window that looked at the building across the street, a whiteboard that covered one full wall, and a chair that was not the chair he'd want, but was not bad. He put his bag down. He stood in the middle of the room for a moment, looking at the whiteboard. He had not had a whiteboard in a long time. He had notebooks. He had the kitchen table. He had occasionally scrap paper because his brain needed surfaces and he used whatever was available. He stood in front of the whiteboard for a minute. He picked up a marker, blue, the same color he'd used in the conference room on 35, and wrote one line at the top of the board. Layer 4 buffer sink under variable load. Does the correction hold at 70% threshold? He hadn't been able to finish that question. He'd walked away from the conference room and gone back to his cart and never had the space to finish it. Now he put the marker down and looked at the question on the board. He had somewhere to put things. The all-staff meeting happened at 9:15, broadcast through the building's internal system to the common screens on each floor and to individual workstations. Victoria ran it from the 42nd floor in the large conference room with no presentation slides and no prepared remarks that anyone could see. Ethan watched it from the small screen in room 407, standing. She began with the logistics system failure 6 weeks ago. She didn't use corporate language or frame it as a case study. She just described it, plainly, what had happened and what the stakes had been. Then she described the solution. She named him. "Ethan Holloway has been working in this building since October," she said. "He was a member of our building maintenance team. He walked past a conference room where 6 hours of engineering work had not solved a critical problem, and he asked to borrow a marker." She paused. The company's first response to that was not gratitude. It was a formal HR notation and a meeting designed to establish that he had overstepped. She didn't soften this or hedge it. "I want to be honest about that because I think honesty about what we got wrong is the only way to actually fix it." Ethan looked at the small screen. "Ethan is now part of our team in a different capacity," she continued, "but I'm not talking about this because of his new role. I'm talking about it because of what this building almost did to him and what that tells us about how we see people." She stopped for a second. "We almost punished someone for being brilliant in the wrong uniform. I don't want that to happen in this company again. Not to him, not to anyone." The room on 42, visible briefly on the feed, was quiet. "That's not a policy announcement," she said. "I'm not launching an initiative. I'm telling you what I think, as the person who runs this company, about what happened in this building and about what I expect from this point forward." She ended it there. No tagline, no closer. The screen went back to its default. Ethan stood in room 407 and looked at the whiteboard for a minute. He thought about the morning in October when he'd stood in the lobby in his worn boots and watched the people in tailored coats moving through the revolving doors. He thought about Roy showing him the supply room and the cleaning schedule. He thought about the conference room on 35 and the 6-hour-old problem on the whiteboard and the 90 seconds it had taken and the way he had handed the marker back and said sorry for the interruption and gone back to his cart.
He sat down at the desk. He opened his notebook to the page he'd been working on, the layer 4 correction, the variable load question he'd never had space to finish. He started working. The engineering team's reaction was not uniform, which was the honest thing about it. Some of them received Victoria's announcement with the particular relief of people who had felt a low-grade discomfort about what had happened and now had official permission to feel that the discomfort had been correct. A few of them had been in the conference room on 35 and had watched Ethan hand back the marker and leave. And the memory of that had been sitting in some inconvenient compartment of their professional conscience ever since. Others were warier. There was a subset of engineers, not large but not small, who had spent years building expertise in the very systems that Ethan had walked past and solved in 90 seconds. And the response to that, for some people, was gratitude. And for others, it was the particular defensiveness of someone who wonders what it means about them. The senior engineer who had been in the room that day, the woman named Diane, who had picked up the tablet and started running the math before Ethan had even put the marker down, sought him out on his third day. She found him in room 407 in the early afternoon, in front of the whiteboard. She knocked on the open door. He turned. "Diane Park," she said. "I was in the room." "I remember," he said. She looked at the whiteboard, at the layer 4 question at the top, and the 3 full boards of work below it that had accumulated over 3 days. "You're still on it," she said. "The correction holds at 70% mostly," he said. "But there's an edge condition I keep coming back to. Above 72% with specific buffer timing, there's a secondary loop risk I don't think we've addressed." She stepped into the room. She looked at the board. Her expression was the expression of a person who was tracking something complex in real time. "Walk me through it," she said. He walked her through it. She asked 2 questions. He answered both. She pointed at something in the middle of the third board and said, "This step, why are you assuming constant sync intervals?" "I'm not," he said. "That's the edge condition. When the intervals vary outside a specific range, the assumption breaks." She was quiet for a moment. "We haven't tested that range." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm still on it." She looked at the board for another minute. Then she said, "I have a team of 4. We've been on a different project this week, but I can get us a day on Thursday. I don't want to pull you from... If there's a secondary loop risk in the system we just recovered, I want to know about it before it matters," she said. She looked at him. "Is that okay with you?" He had not been asked that question, "Is this okay with you?" in a professional context in a long time. He'd been told things, asked to do things, informed of decisions. The courtesy of the question was not small. "Thursday works," he said. She nodded. She turned to go. At the door, she paused. "For what it's worth," she said, without looking back, "what you did in that room. I've been working in systems architecture for 11 years. She stopped. "I know what it was." Then she left. He stood in front of the whiteboard for a moment. He picked up the marker and went back to work. Derek Vaughn cleared his office on a Thursday. He did it early, before most of the building was in, which was the decision of a man who preferred to manage optics even when the optics were already decided. He took a box, filled it with the things from his desk that were his, a framed photo, a few books, the small award plaque from an industry conference 4 years ago, and he walked out through the side entrance on 12. Nobody saw him go, or rather, the people who saw him go were the maintenance crew finishing the night shift, and they saw him the way the maintenance crew saw most things, noting it, not commenting on it, moving on. He had received his settlement terms on Wednesday. He had signed them on Wednesday evening. The agreement was mutual non-disparagement, which meant he would not talk about Nexus, and Nexus would not talk about him. And in practice, what it meant was that the 3 complaints in the HR file stayed in the file, and the supply room conversation stayed in whatever room it had happened in, and everyone moved forward. He had not said anything to anyone in the building in his last week. He had not looked for a moment of resolution or a final conversation that would reframe things. He had packed his box and left early, and that was the shape of his departure. Not dramatic, just done. Ethan did not know about Derek's exit until Roy told him on Friday, in the hallway near the elevator bank on 4. "He's out," Roy said. Ethan nodded. "How do you feel about it?" Roy asked. He asked it the way Roy asked most things, not probing, just direct, because Roy did not see much point in asking around the outside of a question. "I don't feel much about it," Ethan said. "I feel like it was the right outcome. That's different from feeling satisfied. Roy looked at him. What's the difference? Ethan thought about it. Satisfied means it's about me. The right outcome means it's about the other people in his department who had to navigate him for 4 years. Roy turned his coffee cup in his hands, an unconscious echo that neither of them noticed. Lucy said she heard he signed something. So I'm told. Good, Roy said. Just that. One word, with the finality of a man who had been waiting a long time to say it, and didn't need to say anything more. 3 weeks into his new role, Ethan was in the middle of a session with 2 junior engineers, a pair named Sam and Wei, who had the energy of people who had been waiting for permission to think differently about certain problems, and were now using that permission with some intensity, when his phone buzzed with a message from Sophie. He had set up the messaging system with Sophie's school tablet, the same way he'd set it up in Millhaven, which allowed her to send him short messages during free periods. The school approved this because it was one way during instructional hours, and Sophie had never abused it. The message said, "Miss Holt says tornadoes are the most interesting. I told you." He looked at it. He read it twice. Sam and Wei had paused in whatever they were doing and were looking at him with the mild curiosity of people who had learned to pay attention to the small shifts in this particular person's expression. "Everything okay?" Sam asked. "My daughter was right about something," Ethan said. "About weather." Sam and Wei exchanged a glance that was equal parts confusion and the quiet recognition that this was probably not a conversation they needed to enter. Ethan put the phone face down and went back to the problem. But the corner of something that had been tight for a long time was, in that moment, a little looser. Not fixed, not resolved, just a little easier to carry than it had been the day before. He was home at 2:47. Sophie's van came at 3:45. He made tea, stood in the kitchen, looked at Claire's photograph on the shelf, thought about the whiteboard on 4 and the edge condition he still hadn't solved, and Thursday's session with Diane's team. He thought about a lot of things. That had always been his problem, and also the thing that made him useful. And for the first time in a long time, both of those things felt like they could exist in the same space without one canceling the other out. The van came at 3:45, exactly as it always did. Sophie came through the door, dropped her bag, announced that Fernando the plant had grown a new leaf, and asked what was for dinner. "Pasta," he said. "It's not Thursday," she said. "Pasta is for any day." She considered this with the seriousness it deserved, decided to accept it, and went to take off her shoes. Ethan turned back to the stove. Outside, the city kept doing what cities do, moving, generating noise, indifferent to small domestic moments, indifferent to the fact that a man was standing in a 4th-floor apartment kitchen making pasta on a Wednesday, which was not pasta day, and that this small wrongness felt for reasons he could not have fully articulated, like exactly the right place to be. The secondary loop risk turned out to be real. Diane's team found it on the Thursday session, 3 hours in, when Sam ran the variable interval test at 74% load, and the system produced exactly the edge condition Ethan had been circling for 2 weeks. It wasn't catastrophic, not the kind of failure that would have taken the whole system down the way November's crisis had, but it was the kind of quiet degradation that compounds over time, the kind that shows up 6 months later as unexplained latency and intermittent errors that take a team another 6 hours to chase down. They found it before it mattered. That was the point. Diane stood in front of the whiteboard in room 407. They had migrated here naturally because Ethan's board had the full problem history on it, and starting fresh elsewhere would have lost something, and looked at the confirmed test result with the expression of someone crossing something significant off a list. "We need to patch the base system," she said. "The patch is straightforward," Ethan said. He had already written it out. 2 steps, same logic as the original correction. The interval variance just needs to be bounded before the 4th layer receives it. Wei looked at the board. How did the original fix not catch this? Because the original fix was built under crisis conditions in 90 seconds, Ethan said. He said it without apology or false modesty, just accurately. It solved the immediate problem. It wasn't a full audit. "And you've been auditing it since," Diane said. "I had a whiteboard," he said. "And time." Sam laughed. Not performatively, just genuinely, the laugh of someone who had been in the room long enough to understand what that sentence actually contained. Wei smiled. Diane looked at the board and then at Ethan with the particular expression she'd been developing over 3 weeks of working alongside him, which was something between professional respect and the mild exasperation of someone who kept discovering that the ceiling she'd thought was there wasn't. They submitted the patch to the system team that afternoon. It was reviewed, tested, and implemented by end of week without incident. The CTO sent a brief email to the engineering floor noting the catch and the correction. He CC'd Victoria. Victoria forwarded it to no one. She read it, noted it, and went back to her day. But that evening, in her office after the building had mostly emptied, she sat with the email open on her laptop and let herself feel, for a minute, what she usually didn't make time to feel during working hours. The specific satisfaction of a thing going right, not perfectly, not without cost or difficulty or the residue of all the things that had gone wrong before it, just right, in the particular way that real things go right, which is messily and incrementally and only visible in retrospect as the shape it was always going toward. She had not expected, when she'd read Ethan's flagged application 6 weeks before he walked through the doors, that any of this was where it would land. She had expected, she didn't know exactly what she had expected. A conversation, maybe. A chance to understand what had happened to the person she remembered. She had not expected the whiteboard, or the notebook, or the supply room, or the board meeting, or the Saturday morning in the Glenner district apartment where she had sat across from a man in a worn jacket and understood for the first time clearly the specific shape of the life he had built, and what it had cost, and what he had decided was worth it. She closed the laptop. She looked at the city. She had been running this company for 18 months, and she had made good decisions and bad ones, and decisions that were somewhere in the complicated middle, and she had learned, was still learning, that the quality of a decision was not always visible at the moment of making it. Sometimes the thing you did that felt most uncertain was the thing that held the most weight. Sometimes the most important call you made in a week was the one to tell James to hold a resignation letter. She didn't think about this in terms of wisdom or growth, the way self-improvement books wanted you to think about it. She thought about it the way she thought about systems. There were inputs and there were processes and there were outcomes, and sometimes the outcome you got was not the one the input predicted. And the job was to understand why, and to be honest about it, and to build better from what you learned. She went home. December moved through the city in its usual way, faster than expected, louder than comfortable, with the specific energy of a month that contains too many things and not enough time for any of them. Sophie had a class presentation on weather systems. She had, against Ms. Holt's gentle advisory, chosen tornadoes, and she had prepared for it with the focused intensity she brought to things she'd already decided she was going to win. Ethan helped her build a visual aid out of cardboard and blue paint that was supposed to represent atmospheric rotation but looked, in the end, more like a blue spiral. Sophie declared it accurate enough and taped it to the presentation board. She got a 91 on the presentation. She came home and told Ethan the 2 points she'd lost were for presentation volume, which she disputed on the grounds that the topic was inherently loud. Tornadoes are loud, she said. Holt may have wanted the presentation to be quieter than the tornado, Ethan said. Sophie considered this and decided not to comment. He put the 91 on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a pineapple that had come with the apartment and that they had kept because Sophie liked it. Next to it was a drawing she'd done of the two of them, which had the particular quality of Sophie's art. Recognizable in intent, impressionistic in execution, emotionally accurate in a way that technical skill was not required for. In the drawing, he was taller than he was in reality, and she was approximately the same height as him, and they were both smiling with the wide, simple smiles that children draw when they draw happiness. He looked at that drawing sometimes when he was tired. He looked at it the way you look at a compass, not for decoration, but for direction. Victoria held the company's annual review meeting in the third week of December. This was a full leadership gathering, department heads, senior managers, the board members who attended in person rather than remotely. It happened every year, always in the large conference room on 42, always with the same general structure. Year in review, performance metrics, culture assessment, outlook for the coming year. This year she added something. She had thought about it for 2 weeks before deciding, and she had talked to exactly one person about it, Ethan, in room 407, on a Tuesday morning when she'd come down from 42 without announcing it and knocked on his open door. He had been at the whiteboard. He was usually at the whiteboard in the morning. "I want to do something at the annual review," she said. "I want to talk about what happened this year, the full version, the system failure, your hire, the board meeting, Derek, all of it." He turned from the board. "In front of the leadership team." "And the board," she said. "The full room." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because it needs to be on the record," she said. Not in a memo, not in an HR note. In a room, out loud, where everyone who is there for any piece of it has to sit with the whole picture. He was quiet for a moment. You don't need me there for that. I know, she said. I'm not asking you to be there. I'm telling you what I'm doing. She paused. But I wanted you to know first. He turned the marker over in his hands. He looked at the board. Okay, he said. Okay, you're fine with it, or okay, you heard me? Both, he said. She left. He went back to the whiteboard. The annual review meeting was on a Thursday, which was pasta day, which Ethan noted internally with the small private humor of a man who had started measuring time in domestic rhythms, and found that this suited him better than he'd expected. He was in room 407 that morning, working when the meeting was happening 40 floors above him. He was not there. He had not been asked to be, and he had not asked to be. But at 10:47, his phone showed a message from James that said simply, "Going well." And at 11:32, another one. Room gave her a standing ovation. He read that second message twice. He put the phone down and looked at the whiteboard and thought about a woman in a wheelchair addressing a room of people who ran a billion-dollar company, telling them what they had almost done and what they needed to do differently, and the room standing for it. He thought about what it took to do that. To be in a position of authority and use it not to protect yourself from accountability, but to put the accountability in the room and make everyone look at it. He thought that was a harder thing than most people would understand, because authority was comfortable, and comfortable things were easy to protect, and she had chosen, instead, to make the room uncomfortable in service of something that needed to be said. He picked up his marker. He wrote, at the bottom of the current board, "Edge condition under load. What holds when the comfortable assumption changes?" It was not about the system. Or it was about the system. Both things were true at once, which was often how the things worth thinking about worked. The weeks between that meeting and the new year were quieter than the ones that had preceded them, and the quiet was not empty. It was the quiet of a thing that had moved through its crisis and was now in the steadier work of becoming what it was going to be. Ethan ran 2 sessions a week with the junior engineering team. He had not been given a curriculum or a format. Victoria had been deliberate about that, telling him only that the goal was to help engineers develop the capacity to see problems from multiple angles before committing to a solution. What he did with that was his own. He did not lecture. He brought problems, real ones, drawn from the building's actual systems and operations, and he put them on the board and sat down and asked the room what they saw. The first session had been uncomfortable in the way that sessions without a clear structure are uncomfortable when the people in them have been trained to expect structure. Sam had asked twice if there was a right answer. Ethan had said there was always a right answer, but the session wasn't about finding it. It was about understanding all the wrong answers well enough to know why the right one was right. This had produced a silence and then a tentative beginning, and then by the end of 2 hours, a conversation that was genuinely Ulf in the way that conversations between people who are actually thinking are alive. By the 4th session, no one asked if there was a right answer. By the 6th, Sam had started bringing his own problems to the board without being prompted, and Wei had developed a habit of challenging every assumption in the first 5 minutes of any new problem, which was annoying and also exactly the point. Diane attended when she could. She sat in the back, usually, and listened. She rarely spoke during the sessions, but afterward she would find Ethan in the hallway or in the break room and say something specific. One observation, one question. The kind that indicated she had been tracking the whole session and had found one thread worth pulling. "You do this thing," she said to him one afternoon in the corridor outside 407. "When someone's on the right track, you don't tell them. You just stop asking questions." "Well, if I tell them they're right, they stop thinking," he said. She looked at him. "How long did it take you to figure that out?" He thought about it honestly. "I had a daughter," he said. "She taught me most of it." Diane looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed. A real one, the kind that surprised her slightly. "That's the most useful thing anyone said to me about pedagogy in 15 years, she said. "Don't tell anyone. It'll ruin my mystique." She was still smiling when she walked away. He went back into room 407 and sat down at his desk and realized, in the way you realize things that have been true for a while before you name them, that he was content. Not triumphant, not arrived at some destination he'd been aiming for. Just content? In the specific way that means the work in front of you is the right work,
and the life around the work is the right life, and you are not constantly holding both of them in tension against each other. That was not a small thing. He knew it was not a small thing. He told Roy at the end of January. They were in the supply room on 9, Old Habits. Ethan still found himself in that room occasionally, not from nostalgia, but because the building's footprint lived in his body now, the way any place you've worked every morning lives in your body. And Roy was doing an inventory check, and Ethan was leaning against the shelving unit the way he used to when he was restocking the cart. "I want to say something," Ethan said. Roy looked up from his clipboard. "The scheduling model," Ethan said. "The custodial allocation one. I finished it. If you want to implement it, it's yours. I can walk your team through it." Roy looked at him for a moment. "You do that." "You gave me 3 days when you didn't have to," Ethan said. "Twice." Roy turned the clipboard around in his hands. He was not a man who received things easily. He was better at giving than receiving, the kind of person who kept accounts and felt them as a weight until they were settled. "It was 2 extra days total," Roy said. "That's not worth a scheduling system." "The scheduling system was going to end up somewhere anyway," Ethan said. "I'd rather it end up somewhere useful." Roy looked at him for a long moment. "You bring it to my team Tuesday?" he said. "Tuesday works," Ethan said. Roy went back to his clipboard. "For what it's worth," Roy said, without looking up, "you were one of the best I had. Even if you were only doing it for 2 months. Ethan looked at the shelving unit, at the organized rows of cleaning supply that he had restocked hundreds of times. He thought about the first morning, Roy walking him through the route, the laminated schedule card. He thought about the particular dignity of work that most people looked past. "It was good work," Ethan said. "I mean that." Roy nodded once. He meant it too. Sophie turned 8 in February. She had specific requirements for her birthday, which she had communicated in writing. She had started writing things down, a habit she seemed to have absorbed from watching her father. And the requirements included pasta for dinner, specifically not the jarred sauce, but the one Ethan made from scratch on special occasions, a chocolate cake with exactly 8 candles and no trick candles, because she had experienced a trick candle at Priya's birthday and found it upsetting, and the presence of Captain at the dinner table. "Captain can't eat dinner," Ethan said. "He can observe," Sophie said. Captain observed. Priya came over, and Priya's mother Divya, and Mrs. Tran from down the hall, who brought a container of something savory that she set on the counter without explanation and that turned out to be extraordinarily good. They ate at the kitchen table, which wasn't large enough for 5 people in a stuffed bear, and managed anyway, the way kitchens manage when they're the center of something. Sophie blew out her candles in 2 tries, which she was moderately disappointed about. "One breath," she said. "Next year," Ethan said. "I'll practice," she said. "You'll practice blowing out candles." "I'll practice blowing," she said. Generally, lung capacity. Mrs. Tran found this extremely funny. Divya found it funny, too. Priya was already on her second piece of cake and had missed the exchange entirely. After Priya and Divya left, and Mrs. Tran had gone with her container and a piece of cake wrapped in foil, and Sophie had been installed in bed with Captain and the birthday's particular exhaustion that makes children go quiet quickly. After all of that, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with the leftover cake and the 8 candles still in their holes and the photograph of Claire on the shelf across the room. He looked at it for a while. He thought about Sophie at 8, which Claire had not seen. He thought about Sophie at 7 and 6 and 5, all the years that had been only his to carry. He did not think about this with bitterness. He had learned slowly that bitterness was a tax on presence, and presence was the only thing Sophie had ever actually needed from him. But he thought about it honestly because Claire deserved honesty, even in the form of quiet acknowledgement in an empty kitchen. She would have loved tonight, he thought. She would have laughed at the trick candle story for a week. He sat with that for a while. Then he got up and put the leftover cake in the refrigerator and washed the dishes and went to bed, because tomorrow was a Tuesday and he had a session with Diane's team at 9 and he needed to be up at 5:30. This was his life. It was not a perfect life. It was full of the usual textures of an imperfect life, the financial calculations, the loneliness that moved in and out like weather, the grief that did not finish but changed shape, the daily management of a child who was her own complete person, with her own complete opinions about tornadoes and candles and the observational rights of stuffed bears. It was a life that had cost him things he could not get back and had given him things he had not expected, and that continued, day after day,
to do both of those things simultaneously. He was learning to hold that without needing to resolve it. In March, Victoria restructured the internal consulting function. It was not a dramatic change. She had a way of implementing significant things in ways that didn't feel seismic until you were already living in the new configuration. What she did was formalize what had been happening organically. Ethan's sessions with the junior engineers became an official program, a 12-week rotation that every new technical hire at Nexus would complete in their first year. She gave it a name, which Ethan objected to as unnecessary, and she told him the name was for the program, not for him, which was a distinction he accepted without enthusiasm. She also expanded his scope. Not his title. The title stayed Systems Consultant, which he preferred because it said what it was without saying more than it needed to, but his access and his mandate. He was brought into the early stages of 2 new system architecture projects, not to lead them, but to sit with the teams in the early problem framing phase, the part of the process that usually happened in a conference room before anyone had committed to a direction. He was good at that phase. He was good at it specifically because he was not the one who had to implement the solution. He had no stake in any particular approach, no reputation investment in a method he'd championed before. He could look at a problem cold, without the warming distortion of prior commitment, and ask the questions that people who were already too close to the work had stopped asking. "You're a red team of 1, Sam said to him, after a particularly productive early-stage session on a new logistics modeling project. "I'm just asking questions," Ethan said. "That's what a red team does." Ethan thought about this. "Then the goal should be to not need one," he said. "The goal should be for the team to red team itself." Sam looked at him. "Is that what the sessions are for? You're teaching us to do what you do." "I'm trying to," Ethan said. "I won't be here forever." Sam went quiet. There was something in the way he'd said it, not dark, just straightforward, the natural acknowledgement of someone who understood that no arrangement was permanent, that landed differently than Sam had expected. "Where are you going?" Sam asked. Ethan picked up his coffee. "I have no idea," he said. "That's not the point. The point is that what you're building shouldn't require me to function." Sam sat with that for a moment. "That's either very generous or very frustrating," he said. "Both," Ethan said. "Usually at the same time." It was Victoria who said the thing that stayed with him, and she said it in the most ordinary possible setting, which was the break room on 42 on a Thursday morning when they had both arrived early and the coffee had just finished, and neither of them was in a meeting for another 20 minutes. She had poured her coffee. He had poured his. They were standing, she at the counter, he leaning against the opposite one, in the particular easy quiet that had developed between them over months of working in the same building and occasionally working alongside each other and having, in the spaces between the work, real conversations of the kind that only happen when 2 people have known each other a long time, and the professional context has stopped feeling like the whole story. She had been telling him about a board discussion from the previous week, something about the company's growth projections, and a question one of the board members had raised about whether Nexus's culture could scale, whether the things that made it work at its current size would hold up under expansion. "What did you say?" Ethan asked. "I said culture doesn't scale automatically," she said. "It has to be built into the structure intentionally, or the structure grows around it and crushes it." He nodded. "Harold pushed back," she said. He said culture is about people, not structure, and you can't structurally engineer people." "What do you think?" She looked at her coffee. "I think he's half right. Culture is about people, but people respond to structure. What you reward, what you punish, what you let slide. That's structure, and it shapes people whether you intend it to or not." She paused. "We almost let something slide that would have told everyone in this building exactly what we valued. That would have been structural, even if it didn't look like it." He understood what she was not saying directly, which was that the thing that had almost been let slide had been him. "Do you think it worked?" he asked. "What you did? The board meeting, the announcement, all of it." She looked at him with the directness she always brought to questions that deserved it. "Ask me in 5 years," she said. "Culture change takes that long to know if it held." "That's honest." "I'm trying to be," she said. She looked at her coffee again. "I think something shifted. I don't think one announcement shifts a culture. But I think people remember what happened in that conference room on 35, and they remember what the company did about it. And those memories go into the weight that holds the structure up." Maybe. He thought about that. The edge condition, he said. She looked at him. What holds when the comfortable assumption changes, he said. That's what you're talking about. Whether the structure is strong enough to hold under conditions it wasn't originally tested for. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. That's exactly what I'm talking about. They finished their coffee. They went to their respective floors. It was a Thursday, and Ethan had pasta ingredients at home, and Sophie had announced the previous evening that she wanted to help make the sauce this week, which meant dinner would take longer and be messier and would probably be better. These were the things that were true at the same time. The large and the small. The structural and the domestic. The things that would matter in 5 years, and the things that only mattered today, and the thin, real thread that connected them. Here is what this story is actually about. It is not about a brilliant man who was overlooked. Stories about overlooked brilliance tend to comfort the wrong people, saying, they reassure you that talent always surfaces eventually, that the world corrects itself, that the meritocracy works if you're patient enough. This story is not interested in that comfort because that comfort is not earned by the facts. The facts are, Ethan Holloway was exceptional, and he was invisible for 11 years, and the invisibility was not a mistake the system was about to correct. The system was not going to correct it. The system had processed him as a janitorial hire and filed him there, and the only reason anything changed was that one specific person looked at a name on an application and remembered it, and then made a series of choices that were not required of her and that cost her something every time she made them. That is the actual mechanism. Not fate, not justice, not the inevitable surfacing of merit. One person, one decision, one held resignation letter. The corollary is uncomfortable. For every Ethan Holloway whose application lands in front of someone who knows what they're looking at, there are 100 who don't. This is not a story that fixes that. It is a story that happened inside a specific set of circumstances that happened to contain Victoria Ashcroft. And Victoria Ashcroft is not a system. She is a person, which means she is rare, which means you cannot count on her to exist everywhere. What you can count on, what this story suggests you can count on, is the choice. The individual choice, made by an individual person, to look more carefully at the name on the application, to hold the resignation letter, to go to the supply room conversation with Roy, to walk into the board meeting without editing herself. These are not systemic solutions, they are human ones. And human solutions are imperfect and inconsistent and dependent on the particular humans who happen to be in the room. But they are not nothing. They are, in fact, the only mechanism by which systems ever actually change. Not from the outside in, but from the inside, one person making a different choice than the system's default, and then making it again until the different choice becomes the new default. Ethan understood this. He had spent 11 years watching systems and their defaults, pushing cleaning carts through conference corridors and making observations in a notebook that no one asked him to make. He had not been waiting to be rescued. He had not been passive. He had been present, in his life and in his work and in his fatherhood, with a completeness that most people mistake for sacrifice because they cannot conceive of choosing it. What he had chosen to sacrifice was the version of himself that other people would have recognized more easily. The credential, the title, the visible ascent. He had traded that, not regretfully, not permanently, but as a clear-eyed decision about what mattered more in a specific season of his life, for the ability to be home at 3:45 when the school van came. There is no moral that makes that trade beautiful. It was hard. It cost him. He was lonely in ways he did not articulate and tired in ways he did not show. And there were mornings in the Glenner district apartment when the radiator knocked and the sky was gray and Sophie needed something he wasn't sure he had left. He did it anyway. Not because it was noble, because it was what he had decided, and he was a man who followed through on his decisions, and his daughter was the reason, and reasons that specific don't require justification. The point, if there is a point, if a story can carry a point without the point flattening the story, is not that virtue is rewarded or that genius rises or that good companies recognize good people. The point is simpler and harder than any of those. People carry more than you can see. The man pushing the cart and the woman in the wheelchair and the engineer who was too close to the problem to see it, and the facilities manager who listened without commenting, all of them were carrying more than the surface showed. The surface is just the surface. It tells you almost nothing. The only way to know what someone is carrying is to look. Actually look, not to evaluate or assess or process through a system. Just to look. The way Victoria looked at a flagged application and remembered a name, The way Roy looked at a man restocking a supply cart and understood something about him without needing it explained. That kind of looking is not a policy. It cannot be mandated or trained into an organization by memo. It is a human capacity, available to everyone and practiced by far fewer, and it costs nothing except the willingness to slow down for a second and see the person in front of you as a full thing, not a category. Ethan Holloway had been a full thing his entire life. He had been a son and a student and a mathematician and a husband and a widower and a father and a janitor and a man who solved problems on whiteboards at 6 in the morning and went home to make pasta and help a 7-year-old with a project on tornadoes. All of those things were true simultaneously, all the time. None of them canceled the others out. The world had, for a significant period of time, chosen to see only one of them. That was the world's loss, and it was also entirely ordinary, and the fact that it changed was not inevitable. It changed because of a held resignation letter, and a Saturday morning visit to a 4th-floor apartment, and a board meeting where someone said a difficult thing in a room full of people who needed to hear it. It changed because of choices. In April, Sophie found a caterpillar on the windowsill. She discovered it on a Saturday morning before Ethan was fully awake, and she came to his bedroom doorway to report it with the urgency of someone who has encountered a situation requiring immediate adult consultation. "Dad," she said, "there's a caterpillar." He was awake. "On the windowsill? How did you know?" "Where else would a caterpillar be?" She brought him to the window. It was small, a pale green thing, moving with the slow, deliberate purpose of something that was not in a hurry and had no reason to be. Sophie watched it with the focused attention she brought to things she had decided were important. "What's it doing here?" she asked. "Migrating, maybe," Ethan said. "Or it came in when the window was open. Should we put it back outside?" He thought about it. "What do you want to do?" Sophie looked at the caterpillar. She looked at the window, at the brick wall outside, and the slice of April sky above it, pale blue with the first real warmth of the year in it. "I want it to be okay," she said. He slid the window open and found a piece of paper and moved the caterpillar gently onto it and placed the paper on the exterior sill, where the caterpillar sat for a moment as if recalibrating and then moved toward the edge with its slow, definite motion, and eventually, they watched until it was out of sight, made its way somewhere that was not a windowsill in a 4th-floor apartment. Sophie watched the space where it had been for a moment after it was gone. "Do you think it'll be okay?" she said. "I think it has what it needs," Ethan said. She considered this. It seemed to satisfy her, which was the thing about Sophie. She did not always need certainty. She just needed an honest answer. They made breakfast. She talked about a book she was reading, a new one, not the horse book, something about a girl who goes to a school on a boat. He made eggs the way she liked them, which was scrambled but not runny, and toast with the good butter, and they sat at the kitchen table where so many ordinary Saturday mornings had happened and would keep happening. The photograph was on the shelf. The butterfly drawing was above Sophie's door. The notebook was on the counter, a new one, already half full. Outside, April was doing what April does in cities, uncertain, occasionally warm, carrying the specific promise of something that is not yet here, but is no longer very far away. Ethan looked at his daughter eating toast and arguing gently with a point he'd made about the boat school book, and he thought about all the things that had led to this specific Saturday morning. The things chosen and the things that had happened to him and the long, difficult middle years between who he'd been and who he was now. And he did not try to make it into a lesson or a conclusion. It was just his life. All of it, the whole weight and texture of it, sitting at a kitchen table on a Saturday in April with eggs and toast, and a daughter who was 8 years old and had opinions about boat schools and had placed a photograph of her mother on a shelf and had declared a caterpillar's departure satisfactory. He could not have told you, in any precise way, what he had learned. He was not a man who organized his experience into lessons. He was a man who worked and observed and held things together and showed up and started again when starting again was required. That was enough. That had always been enough. He finished his breakfast. The morning continued. The city outside made its noise. Sophie moved on to a second piece of toast and a more specific complaint about a plot point in the boat school book that she felt was unrealistic. "Boats don't have libraries that big," she said. "Some do," Ethan said. "How do you know?" "I've read things." "What things?" "Things about boats," he said. She looked at him with the expression she used when she suspected he was making things up, which he occasionally was. "Name one boat with a library that big."
He named one. She looked it up on the school tablet, confirmed it, and was silent for a moment with the quiet dignity of someone reassessing a position. Okay, she said, but it's still unrealistic for a school. Fair, he said. Outside, April.
Inside, eggs and toast and a daughter who was learning to be wrong and then recover from it with something like grace, which was not a skill that arrived complete, but was built slowly from the accumulated experience of being wrong and finding out that you survived it and that the people who mattered to you were still there on the other side. He was teaching her that the only way he knew how to teach anything, by doing it himself, imperfectly, in front of her, over and over, without pretending it was something other than what it was. It was not a perfect method. It was the only one he had, and it was enough. And the morning continued, and that was the end, and also not the end, the way real endings are. Not a door closing, but a moment passing into the next moment, the story continuing in the direction of ordinary life, which is the only direction worth going.